Welcome to Mystic Realms Recap. Links are in the description below. Please show some love of the author and me. On to the show. Madric's face turned pale the moment he saw Sean. How could he not know what he had done? Thinking back to what had happened 2 days ago, Madric swallowed his saliva with much difficulty, and his expression revealed some fear. What? What exactly do you want? What do I want? Heh. Lin Li bent down with a grin on his face as he stared into Madric's eyes. Don't be so nervous. I don't want to do anything to you. It's just that I've heard Sean mention today that a mage called Madric is missing an opponent to practice with. I wonder if I can have the honor. Really? Madric looked suspicious, and retreated unconsciously. He didn't know why, but he always thought this fellow named Felix looked frightening when he smiled. Of course. Lin Li nodded seriously, and his face was unusually sincere. But at the same time a wind blade tore through the air, and a light swoosh was heard. The wind blade closed in on Madric's inner thigh, and made a long, deep cut. Ah! A shrill cry sounded. In an instant, blood was cascading out of Madric's thigh. Large tracts of blood streamed from the wound and dyed his brand-new grey mage robe red in a flash. Madric's eyes were full of horror. He screamed in despair while desperately clutching his wound. However, no matter how he tried to cover it, he couldn't stop the blood from flowing out. How's that, Mage Madric? I'm quite a good practice buddy, right? Lin Li said cheerfully as he stretched out one hand. There was no indication of him reciting a spell at all, but all of a sudden, there was a violent surge of magical wave, and a soft explosion, followed by a ball of flame ignited from his hand. Madric felt his scalp go numb as he watched the dancing flames. He finally knew what the fellow wanted to do. He wanted to reenact what had happened the day before yesterday. However, the one who was going to lie wailing on the ground would be him instead of the country boy. Don't come near me. Madric seemed to have lost it suddenly. He desperately crawled towards a corner, even disregarding the wound on his thigh. He screamed in anguish as he crawled. Darien is my uncle, he won't let you off. Darien's your uncle? The slowly descending flaming hands froze in midair. The blazing flame was almost touching Madric's nose. Phew, the flaming hands did not come down, and Madric's tightly clenched heart finally relaxed. After letting out a long sigh, he felt a chill on his back. Madric knew that the flaming hands was not used just to scare him. If he had uttered those words a second slower, it would already have landed on his chest. Fortunately, he was quick-witted to mention Uncle Darien at a critical time. The guild's archmage, Darien, is my uncle. I'd advise you not to do anything rash. At the thought of his archmage uncle, Madric felt somewhat emboldened. Oh. So your uncle is called Darien. I thought it was Jirian. Lin Li nodded, and at the same time, the flaming hands came down. Sizzle. When the flaming hands came down, a plume of white smoke sprung up instantly. Amidst the smoke, a strong stench of burnt flesh spread, followed by a shrill cry. Madric fainted almost at the same time the flaming hands came down on his chest. It felt as if being branded by a burning iron. The pain was far beyond what an ordinary person could endure. At that moment, Madric even suspected that his chest had been cooked. Everyone took in a hissing cold breath on seeing the cruel scene. The few young mages stood stupefied there, looking at Lin Li with eyes that were filled with fear. No one had expected the fellow to be so ruthless. Madric had already mentioned that his uncle was the guild's archmage, Darien. However, the fellow seemed to have never heard him, and presented Madric with the flaming hands without second thought, almost cooking his skin right there and then. Everyone wondered what kind of background the fellow had to be so overly arrogant. The unconcerned attitude he carried was as if he had no regard for Archmage Darien. Lin Li was not interested in knowing what they were thinking. He stood up, refreshed, and clapped the ashes off his hands. With a smile on his face, he said politely, "Goodbye, Mage Madric. Remember to say hello to your uncle for me." Almost everyone, including Madric, heaved a long sigh of relief when they heard the words. They were finally seeing this pestilence away. But as soon as the idea popped up, they saw the pestilence halt his steps and say, I forgot the air bomb. Then, there was a muffled sound of explosion. Madrick, who was already somewhat out of his senses, jumped like a frog at the muffled noise. In an instant, there was only a splash of blood, a pool of red, mingled with minced flesh and torn rags, splashed all over the ground. After the air bomb, Madrick seemed to be dead. He lay limply on the ground, and even his breathing became very weak. Everyone saw, clearly, that his whole back had been blown up. From a distance, it was a bloody pile of flesh, just as if he had just been bitten by a wild animal. The flesh and blood were mingled together, and there were a few pieces of cloth in it. The terrible sight made everyone hiss, taking a cold breath. "Sean, let's go." Having done all this, Lin Li left with Sean without another look at Madrick. Such a small character was not worth his attention. When they returned to the guild hall, Anduin had been waiting there for a long time, along with Macklin, the goat-like beard-wearing old man. The latter was really shocked when Anduin entered the door earlier on. The first thought that came to his mind was, "It's over, this old fellow has come to find trouble with Aaron." At the moment, instead of reporting to Aldwin, he had rushed downstairs, and greeted Anduin warmly while trying to probe into his intentions. But the old fellow was so tight-lipped that he refused to reveal why he had come. He looked around and asked about Felix from time to time, which had Macklin in trepidation, nearly scaring him into a nervous breakdown. He was afraid that he would say a wrong word and make the old fellow think that Felix had suffered grievances in the Guild of Magic. Things would be serious then. It was simply a torture to Macklin. Fortunately, the duration of such torture was not too long. When Lin Li walked into the guild hall, Macklin was so relieved that he could hardly wait to jump up and kiss him. Master Felix, you're finally here. Send the old pestilence away as soon as possible." "Kid, where did you go?" Anduin had waited for a long while, and his patience was wearing thin. Just as he was about to reprove the kid, he suddenly noticed a young man, who had a massive frame just like that of a magical beast, following behind Lin Li. In that moment, his eyes could not help but reveal some surprise. He's Sean, my friend from Jerosis." Not bad, not bad." The old man nodded. He had said exactly the same thing as Jirian. As for the reason behind "not bad," Anduin did not elaborate. However, it'd be the same whether he elaborated or not. It was impossible for Sean to know who had praised him with his knowledge. He only knew that this kind-looking old man seemed to be complimenting himself. So, he bowed his head, and gave two modest giggles, which amused Macklin, who was standing at a side. Anduin seldom complimented anyone, even when he saw Gryffindor, he had only said "not bad." And yet, it put Gryffindor in high spirits for a long while. He told everyone he saw that he was someone who had received Master Anduin's compliment before. And look at this black tower-like country boy, who only knew how to giggle inanely. It was as if the one who had complimented him was not a legendary mage, but an old geezer, selling bread next door. By comparing the two guys, Macklin really had to yield to the latter. He cursed in his heart, "Damn that freak Felix, none of the people who have something to do with him are normal people." "By the way, Macklin, I'm going to bring the two of them out, and will probably not be back tonight. Is there any objection from the guild?" Anduin asked democratically before leaving. No objections." On hearing this, Macklin shook his head repeatedly, thinking, "You old pestilence, you've come in person, so who dares to have any objections? If having any is not getting tired of living, then what is it?" Anduin nodded in satisfaction, and praised in his old and aged manner, not bad, you're more sensible than Aaron, that useless bum." By the time the three men came out of the Guild of Magic, it was already pitch dark outside. There was not even a figure in sight out in the cold street. They walked along this cold street all the way out of Alana, and headed for the Nightmare Mountains. The Nightmare Mountains were a long way away, and it took them a lot of time to get there. It was almost midnight when the three men climbed along the rugged mountain road to the top of the highest mountain, looking at the dense forest afar. The Nightmare Mountains at night seemed to be a different sight than during the day. Many of the magical beasts that were common during the day, such as the three-eyed blood wolf, had mostly returned to their nests, and were replaced with all kinds of nocturnal magical beasts. The forest was dark and quiet. The lighting along the way originated entirely from the illuminating spell released by Lin Li. Anyway, his mana was almost infinite. It was nothing even if he used the illuminating spell all the way. Besides, with Anduin, he had no chance to make a move. Along the way, magical beasts appeared from time to time among the trees, but most of them didn't even get to reveal their faces. They merely made some noise by accident, and the old fellow would send a fireball directly in their direction, blowing off each magical beast along with the trees. To Anduin, magical beasts below level 15 were nothing. He didn't even have to use his brain, and could just kill them off with an instantaneous outburst of magic. Lin Li had lost count of the number of magical beasts that had died unjustly in the hands of Anduin along the way. It felt just like driving a steamroller out in the streets. No matter what it was, he'd roll over it first, anything else would have to wait. Eh? As he passed through a bush, Lin Li suddenly stopped in his tracks, for he found that there seemed to be traces of trampling among the thorny bushes. After taking a careful look at it, it seemed that there were quite a few people. The footprints on the ground were numerous and disorderly. At a casual count, there were more than a dozen people. Sure enough, someone has come. Looking at the direction of footprints, it was just north of the forest. This time Anduin felt dejected. He was the one who had discovered the place. These fellows had sneaked in on the sly. What was the difference from grabbing a bite from his bowl? The old man touched his chin, and looked vaguely hostile. Who's the one with no eyes? We'll know when we go over. It didn't matter much to Lin Li. He had only come for the eternal adamantine, anyway. Even if someone had beaten him to it, he'd just have a little less to pick. He didn't believe that someone could pick all the eternal adamantine in just one night. They followed the footprints, and very soon found the northern part of the forest. Before the three men left the forest, Lin Li saw from a distance that there seemed to be a flicker of fire at the place just ahead. A warlock's eyes was summoned by him. Under the control of Lin Li's powerful mental strength, the warlock's eyes seemed to be particularly agile. It soon passed through the dense jungle, mindful of the spot where the fire was noticed by him, gliding towards it quickly. These people obviously came prepared. Even a campsite had been set up. On the plain outside the forest, several tents were connected to each other, and a bunch of bonfires was burning in the middle. There seemed to be something cooking on the bonfire. Food's aroma was coming from the camp a distance away. However, in such a huge camp, there was not even one person in sight. Lin Li frowned, and there was some puzzlement in his expression. The scene was too bizarre. There should be one or two people staying behind to watch over such a big campsite. It was impossible not to sense a trace of life like this. With this hint of doubt, the warlock's eyes flitted quickly through the campsite, and then drifted outside to a nearby cave, which was deep and dark, and seemed to give off a ghastly chill from a distance. Weird. After retrieving the warlock's eyes, Lin Li was still full of doubts. He was a little puzzled indeed. At first, he had thought that everyone had gone into the cave to dig ore, but when the warlock's eyes had scanned the outside of the cave, he realized that the cave was dead silent too. What's the matter? The old fellow was getting impatient. From his point of view, there was absolutely no need to spy with the warlock's eyes. He could just blow them away with a magic spell. He'd tear down the ghost camp first. That fellow with no eyes had gone so far as to snatch a bite from a legendary mage's bowl. There is no one in the camp. Lin Li shook his head, and asked with some doubt, "Did you find anything amiss when you came in the morning?" "There's nothing wrong. It's just a plain and a cave." "Oh, right. It was in this cave that I found the crystal of eternity." Anduin thought for a moment, and added with some hesitation, "What seemed wrong was that cave. It was huge like a maze, and it was cold and dark. When I went in during the day, I had to turn around for a few hours before I found the way out." "Then, let's have a look in the cave?" "Okay, but be careful. Don't lose sight of each other." Indeed, as Anduin said, the cave was just like a maze. After entering the cave, the inside was terribly complicated. The road was winding and more rugged than the path up the mountain. Lin Li maintained his illuminating spell, and led the way in front. He was followed by Shan, who had to bend down slightly to avoid hitting the top of the cave, because he was too tall. Anduin was at the end of the line, for he was the most powerful among them, and so had to stay at the end to deal with all kinds of sudden events. The road in front was always pitch black. No matter how Lin Li enhanced his mana output, the illuminating spell could only illuminate less than 10 meters ahead. A chilly wind would blow from time to time, which added some gloom to the mysterious cave. The surrounding stone walls were wet and humid, and left a greasy feel on one's hands when one touched them. It was just like touching the body of a python. On the whole, this place was unpleasant. After walking through a steep slope, the scene ahead suddenly changed. It was narrow and deep previously, but all of a sudden, it became like a spider's web, extending in all directions. As he stood in front of each entrance, Lin Li suddenly felt as if he had walked into a hive. "How did you walk in the day?" Anduin's voice was somewhat awkward. "I closed my eyes and walked anyhow." Lin Li shook his head. The old guy was really unreliable. He counted the front entrances. There were as many as 7 entrances, both large and small. From the outside, the one in the middle was the most spacious of all the entrances, and from Lin Li's position, he could clearly see that there were faint glimmers inside. It was the unique shine of the eternal adamantine. Since they had come to mine, it was without doubt the best to choose a road with minerals. Lin Li hesitated a little, and led the 2 people into the largest entrance. He did not see it wrong. Shortly after stepping into the entrance, Lin Li suddenly saw that there was a dim glimmer in the open area ahead. The eternal adamantine veins were generally exposed outside the surface, and few were deeply buried in the ground. People who had reached the master level of mineral knowledge like Lin Li could easily find the location of the open vein with its unique shine, just like the one in front of them. Lin Li could see from a distance that it should be a lean ore. After the eternal adamantine contained in it was smelted, it could probably be forged into 2 sets of armor. Although the old man was unparalleled in magic attainments, he was a rookie in the field of minerals. Watching Lin Li stand before a stone in a daze, he could not help but ask in confusion, "Such a stone is worth your coming to the Nightmare Mountains in the middle of the night?" "This is not a stone, it is called the eternal adamantine. It can be used to forge the gold rod and armor. In terms of elemental resistance, it definitely comes first on the list of all magical metals." Lin Li took out a scroll from his robe of wrath as he explained to Anduin patiently. This explanation sounded like gobbledygook to Anduin. What eternal gold, what forged armor? He couldn't understand it no matter what. How could this kid be so young yet know so much? Lin Li pulled out 2 scrolls for air bomb, one of which he held himself, while the other one was handed to Anduin. "When I count to 3 later, you will detonate the air bomb with me." ORH, after a series of shock, Anduin's eyes were glazed. He had completely recognized his fate. This kid was a living monster. You could never understand what was on his mind. Instead of trying to guess, he might as well cooperate and do whatever the kid wanted him to. The 2 air bomb scrolls were inserted into 2 of the cracks of the eternal adamantine vein. Theoretically, the 2 magic spells should be enough to blast the vein open. However, theory was only theory. Even Lin Li himself had never used magic to blast a mine before. In the past, they used geo-explosives, but after coming to Anril, he had never seen anything like this, so he could only make do with using the air bomb. With the idea of trying, Lin Li started counting down. 1, 2, 3. Boom! The rumbling explosion echoed in the cave, and the stone walls around seemed to tremble. Small pebbles spattered, and hit their bodies, bringing them great pain. Dirt and gravel mingled in the air, covering their faces in dust. Lin Li rolled up his sleeves and wiped his face, and the thick dust shook off like flour. This was a typical blast mining method known to Lin Li, but it was the crudest and the most dangerous one. Not to mention it was easy to hurt someone, it was likely to injure the accompanying gemstones as well. Lin Li would not have done so if it hadn't been for the limited conditions. The most precious part of the eternal adamantine vein was its accompanying gemstones, such as the infused crystal, which was something that couldn't be sought, but only found by chance. If one of them was damaged in the explosion, it'd be too late for Lin Li to cry over it. However, there was no other way. The conditions here were too primitive, there was no chance for them to mine the more difficult ones. So many minerals, how are you going to ship them out? Anduin looked doubtful. The eternal adamantine was terribly heavy. The largest piece probably weighed 100 or 200 kilograms. It would take a day or two to move them all out, even for someone with a freaky physical like Sean. Too simple. Lin Li grinned mysteriously as he quietly opened the Ring of Endless Storm. His right hand, which wore the Ring of Endless Storm, seemed to possess a mysterious power. Where his hand reached, the minerals were swept away in an instant. Half of the mineral piles were swept away by him in just a moment's time. Since knowing this kid, Anduin had resigned himself to destiny. He knew that the kid was a monster. His gift in magic was seriously abnormal, but he was also proficient in all kinds of miscellaneous skills. It seemed that there was nothing he couldn't do except giving birth. Sometimes, Anduin would even think that he wouldn't be surprised if the kid really gave birth to a child. After all, a monster was a monster, it couldn't be measured by an ordinary person's values. Nevertheless, he was completely mad when he witnessed this scene. He had seen a lot of spatial equipment, but he had never seen anyone use it the way this kid did. Look at what he had done. The extremely precious dimensional space was actually used by him to hold minerals, which were packed in one after another. In the blink of an eye, almost all the minerals on the ground were swept away as if it was not a piece of spatial equipment, but a garbage bag that could be discarded at any time. Anduin felt guilty just thinking about the abnormality of it. God above. Is there anyone who's more of a wastrel than this kid? The most unacceptable thing to Anduin was that this kid was desperately trying to pack the minerals in, but the spatial equipment never seemed to be filled up. No matter how many pieces of minerals there were, as long as this kid stretched his hand out, the minerals would be gone in a flash. Look how long it took for the whole area of minerals to be almost swept clean. There were only a few small, broken bits, looking pitifully alone in the corner. After finishing all these, Lin Li said in a leisurely manner, "It's called the Endless Storm." On hearing this, Anduin felt that he could not breathe at all. After holding back for a long time, he finally squeezed out 2 words. Bloody hell. Want to take a look inside? Of course. Anduin gnashed his teeth. He had to see for himself today whether the so-called endless storm really had endless space inside. An eternal adamantine vein couldn't stuff you, right? Then we'll blast a few more. Since Anduin had agreed, Sean naturally had no objection. Under the guidance of the illuminating spell, the 3 men gradually went deeper into the cave. As they advanced deeper and deeper, the space around them became emptier and vaster. The cave was like a vase with a thin and narrow opening, but the inside was empty. When the 3 men walked for another few hundred meters, the road ahead was already flat. Did you hear anything? Lin Li was somewhat uneasy walking on this flat road. He constantly felt there was a voice talking to him. It sounded far yet near, sometimes calling out loudly, and sometimes whispering, but when he listened carefully, he could never recognize what the voice was saying. What voice? Kid, you've misheard it. Anduin glanced at him in surprise. There was dead silence in the cave, even the air seemed to be frozen. Where did any sound come from? I didn't hear it, either. Sean nodded in agreement. He had not heard anything indeed. Strange, Lin Li's eyebrows wrinkled slightly. He was sure that he had heard it, there was a voice in the cave. Just as he had uttered the words, the voice rang again. However, the look on both their faces was exactly of the same seriousness. Sean might not have noticed it, but how could Anduin, a legendary mage, not have noticed it? Am I imagining it? Lin Li grumbled in a low voice, but the weird feeling still lingered in his mind. He constantly felt uneasy along the way as if something was going to happen. The feeling made him feel very uncomfortable. Several times, he wanted to stop and end this exploration altogether. When Lin Li bit his teeth and planned to put this idea into action, he was surprised to find another dim light. Obviously, this was another eternal adamantine vein. Judging from its bright color, it might as well be a rare and rich mineral. The eternal adamantine vein was not far in front, probably less than 100 meters away from them. Lin Li's eyes lit up when it was determined to be a rich mine. A rich, eternal adamantine mine was not always available. It meant high-quality minerals together with all kinds of precious accompanying gemstones. Lin Li swallowed his saliva hard, and his previous worries were immediately forgotten. The 10-meter-long vein was exposed outside the surface of the earth. From a distance, it felt winding and undulating, just like the rolling hills. The unique luster of the eternal adamantine gave people a relaxed and refreshed feeling under the light of the illuminating spell, which was quite different from the poor mineral vein that was previously mined. The three men quickened their pace and hurried over. Lin Li reached into his pocket and pulled out a few air bomb scrolls. Blast mining could easily damage the accompanying gemstones, but the present conditions were really poor, so Lin Li couldn't care less. Besides, with his strength as a master of mineral veins, as long as he was careful, he would not deal too much of a damage. But this time, Lin Li dared not give Anduin the scroll. After all, he was a legendary mage, not a legendary miner. Even if his personal strength was powerful enough, he was only a layman in mining. Lin Li could let him waste the poor mineral vein earlier, but he wouldn't dare let him mess up this rich mineral vein. In the face of such an almost perfect vein, even Lin Li himself dared not have the slightest carelessness. After the scroll was taken out, he was not in a hurry to insert it into a crack, but walked back and forth around the vein. This time, he would not allow any negligence in the blasting. He had to take all details into consideration. Lin Li put on his rare serious face as he stood in front of the mineral vein. He rubbed his eyebrows gently with one hand and immersed himself in complicated calculations. The simple yet crude blast mining was inherently prone to accidents. In addition, Lin Li was presently trying to use the air bomb spell instead of geo-explosives, which added to the uncertainties of this mining process. He had to calculate every step carefully so as not to let any accidents happen. It was frighteningly quiet all around. There was no other sound apart from the rhythmic footsteps. Anduin and Shan held their breath almost concurrently, for they knew that this was the most critical moment. Lin Li, who was immersed in thought, could not be disturbed even by a little. Time passed by, and it was unknown how long it took for Lin Li to halt his steps at last. He carefully took out a scroll, and gently inserted it into the crevice of the mineral vein. When he bent down, Anduin and Shan saw distinctly the beads of sweat dripping down from his forehead. The insertion was followed by another one. Lin Li inserted a total of 5 air bomb scrolls into the crevices. The positions of the 5 scrolls were not uniform either. Some were deeply buried in the vein crevices, others were only slightly inserted. Most of the scrolls were still exposed to the air. The depth that they were inserted to would determine the success of this blasting. If there were no mistakes in Lin Li's calculations, this blasting would open the surface of the vein without injuring the accompanying gemstones in the interior. For Lin Li, the accompanying gemstones were the most important. Although the eternal adamantine was a magical metal, it was not very useful for a mage. Its only use was probably to forge a set of equipment for Shan. After inserting the 5 scrolls into the crevices, Lin Li rolled up his sleeves again, and wiped the sweat on his forehead. Then, he slowly retreated beside Anduin, and asked, with a look of fatigue, "How many scrolls can you control within a second?" 3. Anduin thought about it, and gave an exact answer. Besides not consuming magic, there was no difference between a scroll spellcasting and ordinary spellcasting. Both were controlled by the mental strength, and required elemental sequencing. After all, the air bomb spell was a level 5 magic spell. Even if Anduin had reached the legendary level, he dared not undertake more tasks. It was not as simple as 1 + 1 = 2 to release 3 level 5 spells at the same time. This meant that Anduin's mental strength had to control 3 level 5 spells at the same time, and complete the sequencing of these 3 magical elements within the same time frame. This was for Anduin. If a slightly weaker mage, such as Lin, who was only infinitely close to the legendary level, were to handed control of 3 scrolls of air bomb at the same time, he would definitely refuse without even thinking about it. Lin was arrogant, but not crazy enough. What was the difference between controlling 3 scrolls at a time and seeking death? A little carelessness could lead to a mental breakdown. The 3 left ones are for you. Lin Li nodded. He knew that the 3 air bomb scrolls were Anduin's limit. If he were to add another scroll, not to mention Anduin, even if it was Alduin, who was a level higher than Anduin, he could probably only watch at a side. Are you all right? Anduin glanced at him, and there was some worry on his face. His question was obscure, but how could Lin Li not know that the old fellow was concerned about himself? After all, he was just a magic shooter, and was still a long way away from the legendary realm. Even if he was only controlling 2 scrolls concurrently, the old fellow was still worried something might happen to Lin Li. Lin Li felt a gush of warmth to his heart, but merely smiled. Did you forget how I practiced elemental sequencing? Oh, true, Anduin chortled at the mention of this. It was then that he remembered the kind of monster standing before him. It was someone who had practiced elemental sequencing all day long. Although he was still a magic shooter, his mental strength was far beyond this category. Ready. Lin Li tightened his grip on the winter staff, his voice was slightly hoarse. 1, 2, 3. Boom. The 3 of them only felt the ground tremble in the earth-shaking explosion. The power of 5 air bomb scrolls unleashed at the same time was equivalent to the magic spells of an archmage. At that moment, Lin Li even felt that the whole cave had collapsed, large tracts of rubble spattered, and there was a sharp whistling sound in the air. Clouds of dust filled the air, the whole area was as dark as if a sandstorm was brewing. With the previous lesson, the 3 men crouched down almost at the same time with their hands held over their heads as the rubble smashed down on their backs. The burning pain was as if they had been whipped. It was unknown how long had passed before the cave gradually quieted down. Lin Li stood up with some apprehension. Then, he saw that there seemed to be a few glimmers of light among the minerals that were all over the ground. Indeed. Lin Li suppressed the ecstasy in his heart, and slowly walked to the spot of light. It was a dragon's eye about the size of a fist. This was a really good thing. It was said that after the death of the ancient dragon, the pair of eyes would turn into a gemstone with the passage of time. Granted, legends were just legends, and it was difficult to verify the authenticity of it. But one thing was for sure. Legendary dragons were all natural spellcasters. Even newly born dragons could use their dragon roars to unleash a magic spell strong enough to destroy the world. In that distant yet barbaric era, the violent magical elements in the war between the dragons and the titans had torn the whole world apart. And the dragon's eye had a similar power as well. A dragon's eye naturally contained a spell, but no one knew what kind of spell it was and how it came into being. Even Lin Li, a man so erudite he was unlike a human being, had not been able to fully understand its mystery. He only knew that the bigger the dragon's eye was, the higher the level of spell it contained. N0V3LTR0VE served as the original host for this chapter's release on N0V3LB1N. Lin Li had seen numerous dragon's eyes back in the Endless World. However, most of the dragon's eyes were only the size of the thumb, and the spells contained in them were the likes of the Windblade and Icicle. Usually, they were inlaid on rings, and used as underhand tricks. Lin Li felt that the gemstone before them was too much. It was the size of a fist, and probably contained a spell of at least the magic shooter level. This was no joke. The spell contained in Dragon's Eye was not like the low-level stuff from the magic scrolls. It was completely instantaneous, and did not require the control of mental strength. There was no need for elemental sequencing, and there was not even a level restriction for it. Only a trace of mana input was needed to directly activate the spell contained in the Dragon's Eye. Think about it. A spell of the magic shooter level could be released anytime and anywhere, and it was even in an instantaneous outburst. If it was unleashed out of the blue, it could probably even take down an archmage by surprise. If there were any shortcomings, it would be the mana. Dragon's eyes were naturally endowed with. A magic spell, but they had no source of mana. After this spell was used once, it had to be supplemented, be it from a magical crystal or a mage. In short, it was necessary to input enough mana into it to restore the dragon's eye's terrifying magic ability. But when a monster like Lin Li came by it, even its only shortcomings seemed insignificant. How would he worry about the problem of insufficient mana with his almost infinite mana? Compared to this, it was the size of the dragon's eye that had him troubled. It was simply too big. Lin Li had never seen such a large dragon's eye. It was certainly impossible to set it on a ring. Even with such a big ring, Lin Li did not have fingers that were thick enough to wear it. In addition to this dragon's eye, there were several accompanying gemstones scattered around it. Lin Li glanced at the heap of minerals, and spotted a heart of Gaia. The heart of Gaia was not small either, it was the size of an egg. The heart of Gaia was a good item. The earth element contained in it was surprisingly massive. If they were embedded on any equipment, even if it was just an ordinary blouse, it could become invulnerable in an instant. Lin Li was about to bend down to pick up the heart of Gaia when he discovered something else. Among the fine pieces of an eternal adamantine, a crystal of astonishing size was emitting a faint magical aura. Lin Li's eyes almost fell out as he looked at the crystal. It was not only Lin Li's eyes that almost fell out, but also Anduin, who had just hurried forward. Oh my god, Anduin's voice sounded like a somniloquy. He was really suspecting that he was dreaming. This crystal of eternity was just too big. It was lying quietly among the pile of minerals, reflecting a brilliant halo under the illuminating spell. Anduin estimated the volume of the crystal of eternity. It was probably larger than his head. If this were to be carved into potion bottles, then at least 10 of it could be carved out. At the thought of the 10 potion bottles carved from the crystal of eternity being arranged in the potion lab, Anduin's aged face was beaming like a flower in full bloom. The old man had even thought out a scene in his mind. When the 10 bottles were carved, he would show them off in the pharmacists' guild. He wondered what would the expression on Burnside's face be like when he saw the bottles. The old man's satisfaction grew as he stared at the crystal of eternity. By this time, Lin Li had filtered all the gemstones. The harvest for this trip was far beyond his expectations. In addition to the eternal adamantine, there was a fist-sized dragon's eye, an egg-sized heart of Gaia, and a terrifying crystal of eternity. It was a pity to him that there was no infused crystal, the one he wanted most, in the pile of minerals. However, he soon cast it aside after thinking it through. The infused crystal was something that could be met, but not sought. In 1,000 eternal adamantine veins, it was not necessarily possible to dig a piece of it out. After blasting the veins, they'd naturally divide the loots. First on the list was the huge crystal of eternity. Anduin stood up and called dibs on the crystal in exchange for all his wealth. Lin Li pouted, and thought to himself, I know very well about how little your assets are. You're trying to exchange such a huge crystal with what little you have? It'll be good enough for you to exchange them for an amethyst potion bottle, but then again, of the 3, Anduin was probably the most suitable to get this crystal of eternity. The crystal of eternity was really good stuff. Besides the permanent preservation of potions, it could also slowly improve the efficacy of the potions. For a pharmacist, this was a dream treasure. The temptation of this thing to pharmacists was something that Lin Li had personally experienced. He had once sold a small piece of it back in the endless world. He didn't expect, then, that what was originally a tentative move had attracted numerous pharmacists, and the price that he sold it for was unbelievable to Lin Li himself. But the one in front of them was even bigger than others. Lin Li dared not imagine how many pharmacists would have a heart attack if such a large piece of crystal of eternity was brought out. But because it was too big, Lin Li insisted that it was only suitable for Anduin. Indeed, the bigger the crystal of eternity, the better it was. But when it reached a certain extent, its actual value would be greatly discounted. For example, the crystal of eternity before them was big to a scary extent. If it were to be carved into a potion bottle, it could be carved into at least 10 bottles, from big to small, to make a whole set. However, what about that? A whole set of potion bottles carved from the crystal of eternity was really perverted and violent, but that was all. Besides being used for showing off, Lin Li really couldn't think of any other use for them. To preserve potions? There was no need for it at all. Apart from a few, how many potions had to be preserved with the Crystal of Eternity? A glass bottle was more than enough. To improve the efficacy of potions? Stop kidding. It would take months to turn a bottle of mana potion into an awakening potion. It was better to just concoct hundreds of them. It'd be more than enough for them to drink one bottle and throw one bottle away. Was there a need to spend a few months on it? This fellow was a real pharmaceutics guru. Apart from those master-grade potions, how many were worth it to be contained in the Crystal of Eternity? For Lin Li, the size of the Crystal of Eternity was actually irrelevant. One bottle of potion carved from the Crystal of Eternity was enough for him. If he was given a set of bottles of different sizes, he'd have a headache instead. What if he broke one, or what if others were jealous of him? The less trouble you had, the better. Lin Li hated trouble, so he did not hesitate at all, and pushed the Crystal of Eternity to Anduin. Ha ha ha, the old man held the Crystal of Eternity in his hands, and laughed so hard that his eyes narrowed. If old Burnside could see it, I wonder if it would frighten him out. You should accumulate some virtue. Lin Li looked at the crystal, and suddenly sympathized with old Grim. As a potion master, it would be strange to see such a large Crystal of Eternity and not be scared into a heart attack by it. After a long look at the Crystal of Eternity, Anduin finally opened up his spatial equipment. With a cautious look on his face, he kept the king of all crystals away. The old man's spatial equipment was similarly a ring. Nevertheless, compared with the Ring of Endless Storm, the space of this ring was much smaller. A mere Crystal of Eternity had occupied almost half of the space. In the end, Anduin was forced to clear out several magic books from it. And at this time, Lin Li held the dragon's eye in his hand. To him, this was the best choice. Compared with the giant Crystal of Eternity that was filled with an upstart temperament, this dragon's eye was much more low-key. It was yellow and slightly dim. It might be mistaken for an amber stone by someone who had no knowledge of gemstones. Only those who really knew magical gemstones understood the huge gap between the two gemstones. The amber stones were usually used by mage apprentices because they were too weak to control the mana contained in the magical crystals. Therefore, ordinary mage apprentices used ManhwaRecap set on the magical staff to control the mana contained in amber stones. This control was simple, and did not require too much skill. The dragon's eye was at the other end of the pole. Especially the one before them, it was so big that it was scary. Lin Li was almost certain that it contained a spell of at least a magic shooter level. Lin Li had already thought about it. It was impossible to set such a large dragon's eye on a ring. He'd probably have to try on a staff when he returned. Anyway, magical crystals were of little significance to him, they were only a source of mana. To a monster with infinite mana like him, whether the staff was inlaid with a magical crystal or not made no big difference. So, for a long time, Lin Li seldom used the magic staff. The reason why he always carried the winter staff was merely to make himself look more like a mage. However, if the magical crystal was replaced by the dragon's eye, then things would be different. That was some real combat effectiveness. If used skillfully, one could even defeat an archmage. As for this, Lin Li picked up the Heart of Gaia after putting the dragon's eye into the Ring of Endless Storm. This defensive gemstone could only belong to Sean. I'll keep it first. I'll help you blend it into the armor when we get back. ORH, with Sean's knowledge, how could he know what the Heart of Gaia was? He only knew that anything Mr. Felix said couldn't be wrong. The 3 precious accompanying gemstones were distributed. As for the pile of eternal adamantine on the ground, nothing more had to be said about it. Lin Li had swept them all into the Ring of Endless Storm. Watching Lin Li make a sweep of the mineral stones, Anduin had the urge to curse him. This was perhaps what was meant by comparisons are odious. He was a legendary figure, to say the least, but the spatial ring he had was so miserable. He had barely managed to stuff in just a piece of Crystal of Eternity. And look at this kid, the Ring of Endless Storm he had was like a bottomless pit. He could still load it with mineral stones after putting the gemstone in. If it hadn't been impossible to move the kid would have packed the whole cave into the ring. With the ring of endless storm in hand, the speed at which Lin Li swept through the mineral stones was simply astounding. It took him only a few minutes to sweep away the eternal adamantine piled up all over the place a moment ago. As the last of it was put into the ring of endless storm, Lin Li rubbed his sore arm, and was about to stop for breath when he suddenly noticed that there seemed to be something shining in the rubble under his feet. This pile of rubble was located in the center of the previous vein. The whole vein had been blown up by 5 air bomb scrolls. At this time, the stones piled on the ground were those that were connected with the vein. Another accompanying gemstone? Lin Li started in surprise. He hadn't expected that, after coming across 3 of the best gemstones, there was another one waiting for him in the rubble heap. Lin Li had quickly forgotten his sore arm in the face of this unexpected surprise. He bent down in a hurry, and moved the rocks away with his hands. Soon, the shining thing showed its true self. What lay beneath the rubble was not the accompanying gemstone he'd expected, but a glittering and translucent crystal. It was a common crystal. It had neither a magical wave nor elemental power. Lin Li could clearly sense that it was no different from the crystal jewelry from the jewelry stores. To be honest, Lin Li was rather disappointed. He had a hunch that such a rare eternal adamantine vein would contain precious stones of at least the level of the heart of Gaia. Ordinary crystals such as those that could be bought with 10 gold coins were almost certain not to appear. Wrong, Lin Li knitted his eyebrows shortly after. This could not be just an ordinary crystal. Lin Li was very clear about the power of the 5 air bomb scrolls. Under the earth-shaking explosion, let alone an ordinary crystal, even pig iron would be blown up, but the crystal among the rocks was still glittering, and not even a crack could be found. There's a problem with this. At the thought of it, Lin Li hurried to remove that piece of rubble. In order to speed up, he even used the ring of endless storm once again. Andoan almost went crazy. Loading mineral stones into a dimensional space was something abnormal, but this kid had gotten worse. He was actually using dimensional space to load stones. Those were real stones. If he liked them, the Nightmare Mountains were full of them. He could hire a motorcade for 200 gold coins, and load as much as he wanted. The old man was hopping in anger, but there was no time for Lin Li to pay attention to him. The stones were moved away, and the entire crystal was revealed. This crystal looked similar to the dragon's eye, both were of the same size and oval in shape. The only difference was that one was glistening yellow, and the other was shiny and glittering. When Lin Li held it in his hand, he suddenly realized that this crystal did not seem to have been formed naturally, for its surface was covered with a strange pattern. Lin Li knitted his brows again at the sight of the patterns. He constantly felt the pattern was familiar. He stood there and carefully recalled it for a long while before he vaguely remembered, when he was in the endless world, he seemed to have seen similar patterns somewhere. If Lin Li remembered correctly, they should belong to the category of inscription. However, even Lin Li couldn't tell exactly what the pattern stood for. He could only vaguely guess that this should be a ManhwaRecap array because only ManhwaRecap arrays had a large number of magic circuits and a large number of magic nodes, each seemingly independent but interrelated. The source of mana that they tapped into was the same at the end of the day. Lin Li was astonished for a moment. It was uncommon to see a ManhwaRecap array. The combination of more than 3 ManhwaRecaps was qualified to be called a ManhwaRecap array. This was not as simple as adding 1 to 2. ManhwaRecaps were extremely complex per se. The combination of several ManhwaRecaps would cause the complexity to increase exponentially. Even the level certification hall in the Emerald Tower used only 2 ManhwaRecaps, the Element's Annihilation Field and the Magical Shield Field, instead of adding a Magic Exhaustion Field to form a real ManhwaRecap array. Lin Li knew that it was not because the Jurosis Guild of Magic was unwilling, it was because they were unable to do it. It was exactly this reason that Lin Li felt puzzled about. It was only an ordinary crystal, was there a need for a ManhwaRecap array? Lin Li stood there thinking for a long time, but could not figure out why. Finally, he shook his head, and kept the strange crystal in his pocket. In any case, the purpose of this trip had been achieved. Not to mention a set of equipment, even 2 or 3 sets would be more than enough with the large number of eternal adamantine. Adding to it the few precious accompanying gemstones, the harvest of this trip could be said to be far beyond Lin Li's imagination. Want to take a look at other entrances? No, it's so late. I'm going back to bed. I'm getting on with age, and can't be compared with you young people. With the crystal of eternity in his hand, Anduin's heart had long returned to Alana. He could not wait to find a jeweler to carve the giant crystal of eternity into a potion bottle, and then bring it to the pharmacists' guild to show off. How could he still have the thought of exploring other entrances? Then let's go back first, Lin Li nodded, and did not force Anduin. Anyway, he still had to stay in Alana for 3 months, he'd have time to explore the other entrances. They did not have to rush it today. On their way back, Lin Li was still the one leading the way with his illuminating spell. Lin Li listened intently as he walked. He wanted to know whether the voice he'd heard when he entered the cave was his misconception. But this time, the voice seemed to have disappeared. No matter how Lin Li tried to concentrate on it, there was no trace of sound in his ears at all. It was already late at night when they came out of the cave. A crescent moon hung high in the night sky, and the moonlight sprinkled on the nightmare mountains like dew, adding a gentle aura to this crisis-ridden forest. You just cannot hold out for long as you get older. It's just past midnight, and I can't take it anymore. Bad. I have to go back to bed earlier, the old man yawned as he came out of the cave. He kept emphasizing his age, while the power of flight was already released by him. You two, go back on your own. I won't send you. Lin Li was amused and annoyed at the same time. He was a legendary mage, but he was using "can't stay up late" as an excuse. Just say you're itching to go back to show off the crystal of eternity. Do you have to find such a lame excuse? Do some good, will you? Don't frighten an illness out of old Grim. Rest assured, it won't scare him to death. After uttering these words, the old man flew out of the forest. Standing at the entrance of the cave, Lin Li could not help but yawn. The night's ordeal was really exhausting. Even if he was full of vigor, he was just too tired at this time. All he wanted was to go back to the Alana Guild of Magic and have a good sleep, but the world was as such, the more you wanted to sleep, the more it wouldn't allow you sleep. Lin Li was yawning when he heard a terrible scream from afar. The scream was so piercing that it scared off half of Lin Li's sleepiness in an instant. What the heck, Lin Li muttered a curse, but he did not freeze as he promptly released a warlock's eyes. He had heard clearly enough to know that the scream had come from the campsite. Under Lin Li's control, the warlock's eyes turned into a stream of light and glided off in the direction of the campsite. Lin Li was startled when the warlock's eyes approached. The campsite that was dead silent earlier on was buzzing with noise at present. From the warlock's eyes, there was only the glint and flash of cold steel and flickers of magic rays from time to time. Shouts and screams mingled together, and it sounded noisier than exploding the mines with air bomb. This was a battle of great disparity in numerical strength. One side was a team of more than 30 adventurers, while the other side was a single magical beast. Fuck, the shapeshifter. Lin Li's eyes straightened after a thorough look at the situation. It not for the fierceness of the battle, Lin Li really wanted to go over and interview those adventurers to ask them what gave them the courage to climb the Nightmare Mountains in the middle of the night and challenge the shapeshifter. Could it be that they really thought it was something like a unicorn, easy to be trifled with? Wash up and sleep, Lin Li shook his head, having lost the interest to continue watching. In fact, he did not need to watch. What would happen after that would be a massacre through and through. In all the folklore of Amril, the shapeshifters were usually depicted as the mount of demons. They came to the human world in hellfire, along with blood and slaughter. The birthplace of these beasts was definitely locations which suffered calamity. No matter if the disaster was natural or man-made, it was certainly a catastrophe that claimed the lives of thousands and millions. Only this could trigger the birth of the shapeshifters, which were an amalgamation of pure negativity. Suffering and hopelessness were the greatest sources of energy for them. As they were created from negative emotions, their bodies were neither tangible nor a figment, and were born with all sorts of dark magic. At birth, they would be at least level 16. When they had finished evolving, they might surpass the level 20 mark and become a legendary beast. Although that shapeshifter in front of them had yet to surpass level 20, it had already evolved once. There was fire circling around its four limbs, and the color of dark red around its horn. That meant that the beast before them was at least a level 18 one. Since its body did not have a definite form, the beast would have great immunity to any attack, no matter if it were to be a magical or physical one. On top of that, with its proficiency in dark magic, it would be extra difficult for even Macklin, a level 19 senior, to defeat that shapeshifter before their eyes. How could these adventurers be able to deal with such a formidable monster? Strength-wise, the adventurers definitely had an edge over those beasts. Their abilities, however, were not on the same level. Among the 30-odd adventurers, the strongest was just level 12, and the weakest was only level 8. In Master Jirian's words, if they wanted to battle a shapeshifter in such a group dynamic, they would be digging their own graves. Nearly 10 men stayed at the front line. Each of their heavy armors had obviously gone through inscription to protect themselves against dark magic from the shapeshifter. They miraculously pulled through the deadly attacks, and gave the mages behind them precious time to do their recitation. Yet, how would the abilities of a shapeshifter be limited to dark magic? One warrior lost his life in a short-distance attack. When the beast charged at him with its dark red horn, his thick and heavy armor was as if a thin white sheet of paper. Despite having protection, the long horn pierced through his chest. The sharp tip that passed through his back showed faint but bright gleam. Amidst that shriek, blood flowed out profusely, leaving behind an impressive crimson that stained the long horn. Yet, the time that the warrior bought with his life did not manage to bring any impact. The levels of the soldiers in the camp were too low. That was the weakness of a mercenary corps. In Felon Kingdom, there were very few mercenary corps which had the finances to employ powerful mages to aid them. A full set of magical equipment cost at least a few million. How many magical beasts did one have to kill in order to earn this amount of money? Unless the Guild of Magic had the ability to pay a hefty sum to employ them, no magic shooters would want to join the guild as an adventurer. That being said, who would dare to invite Jirian into the team? Lin Li noticed 2 magic shooters in the mercenary corps before him. And that made the team one of the strongest already. Apart from them, the abilities of others were undoubtedly horrible. They were a bunch of level 8 and level 9 mages, nothing comparable to the mages in Jirosa's Guild of Magic. Besides, they were from the capital, Alana. Since their combined strength was weak, their fate had been sealed. In that precious recitation time, most of the mages had already summoned their strongest spells, ranging from Flaming Storm to Arcane Missile, and then Icy Spear to Fireball. The over 10 spells that were cast together raged a magnificent scene of brilliant sparkles. However, what followed that blinding ray of light was a raging hell. Although the deaths of those mages on the front line happened almost concurrently, the damage they could do to the shapeshifter was minimal. Among them, the Flaming Storm had the biggest impact. After all, it was still a spell that only magic shooters could cast. Yet, in dealing with the beast, it seemed to have lost its usual impact. When the sparks were cleared, there were only burnt marks on the body of the beast. Lin Li sighed disappointedly upon witnessing that scene. The Flaming Storm was indeed a powerful spell to injure shapeshifters, but too weak to kill. Since shapeshifters were created from resentment, the most effective way to deal with them would be to use the holy light that had purification properties. However, as Felon was a magical kingdom, very few people would choose to become a priest. That being said, it was even rare to see a paladin around. To be able to find someone who had the skills to purify a shapeshifter would be more difficult than teaching Anduin the art of creating pharmaceutical products. Of course, magical spells would work too, provided they had a strong enough impact. For Anduin, it would only take him one legendary magical spell in order to kill a shapeshifter. And that was what differentiated the realms. To the people who were at the legendary level, intangible opponents like the shapeshifters were definitely not a challenge. For example, to Anduin would not need to consider what spells he should use to deal with the beasts. With the sufficient amount of strength, any spell would be enough to kill, just like how earlier on in the jungle, Anduin's instant yet simple fireball managed to take lives so effectively. Unfortunately, the old man left too hurriedly. Or else, Lin Li would really hope to seek his help to take down that rare shapeshifter in front of him. If anyone could get a hold of the horn of a shapeshifter, they would be envied by everyone. With the addition of their horns, even the value of a normal metal could be multiplied by 100 times. That was due to its firmness, which had been proven by how the shapeshifter managed to slit open the thick and heavy armor of the warrior so easily as though it was a thin piece of paper. Weapons that were forged from the horns of shapeshifters would hold an extremely mighty dark force that could break all protective barriers. With the horns of shapeshifters, the spell of frost would be a mere joke. The magical crystals of the shapeshifters were even more precious to mages. The negative emotions contained inside would be able to enhance the mental spells and spiritual spells by many folds if one of such crystal were to be attached to their staffs. Lin Li was very tempted just by the thought of how he could make use of the body of a shapeshifter for his benefits. Yet it was like a goldfish, one could only see, and not touch. While Lin Li was feeling his share of disappointment, a series of shrieks could be heard from the camp. From afar, the shapeshifter that was provoked by the magical spells looked like a wild horse that had gone loose. Its dark red horn conducted a massive slaughter in the camp. Under the firm and strong horn, the heavy armor was as if a floating cloud. No warrior could withstand the shapeshifter's attacks. At first, there were 7 or 8 warriors battling the beast. Within a second, half were down. Fresh blood oozed out of their wounds, leaving behind a ground of red. The charging shapeshifter was like a real nightmare. It was using its own unique method to spread suffering and hopelessness. Buy some time for the mages, a voice commanded when the team was close to collapsing. That exasperated howl belonged to a young man with golden hair who was standing at a corner of the battlefield. The shrill cry indeed helped to delay the collapse of the team. It motivated the remaining warriors to raise up the weapons in their arms and block the charging shapeshifter. At the same time, the mages behind them completed another recitation. They grew smarter this time round. Instead of using offensive spells to hurt the shapeshifter, they utilized all sort of spells that dealt with states. Among them, there were the delaying spell, blinding spell, and weakening spell, all cast over the shapeshifter like a net. After all, the body of the shapeshifter was half intangible and half tangible. The massive low-grade attacks that focused on its body affected the beast as well. Although resembling insect bites, lacking the power to kill, that indeed caused an irritating feeling for the beast. It is the frustration you get when a buzzing housefly circles around your ear continuously, and you really would hope to smack that tiny bug dead. And that was what the shapeshifter did. That pair of red eyes reflected an extremely bright light. What followed was a huge gush of dark force, which distorted the surrounding space. From how the magical elements sizzled like boiling water, Lin Li knew that it was a powerful and destructive dark magic. Why, Lin Li sighed as he shook his head. He had expected that to be the ending of the team with no one ranked higher than level 12. Let's go back to Alana. Lin Li summoned the hastening spell for himself and Shan to make an escape before the shapeshifter shifted its target to them. In fact, that was the only time Lin Li dared to leave the location. The battleground was in between the cave and the jungle. If one wanted to return to Alana with the same path they came, they could either use the power of flight like Anduin or cut through the battlefield. Yet Lin Li feared that if they were to do the latter, they would trigger the shapeshifter's hostility. Shapeshifters would not care whether you were adventurers or not. As long as you were a human being, it was all the same to them. But it was not a problem now. Thanks to those mages, the shapeshifter had been close to becoming crazy. Even if Lin Li were to walk towards it casually, it wouldn't pay any attention to him. To the shapeshifter, the #1 priority was to find out how to get rid of the buzzing housefly. To be safe, Lin Li did not use the illuminating spell. Both men crept stealthily towards the camp in the dark. Their footsteps were very light. As they stepped on the lush green grass, there were only rustling sounds. The vigorous movement of the dark force and the sizzling waves of magical elements gave everyone a sense of suffocation. Hold on. Everybody hold on, the golden-haired youth screamed with all his might. His voice had already gone hoarse from all the shouting, red veins surfaced in his eyes too. However, it was too late. The brightness of that ray of red light in that pair of eyes filled with suffering and despair had already reached the maximum. The sizzling magical elements were like strong rush of water that surged towards the dam constantly, as if an extra gush of it would open the flap of the dam and flood the entire camp. "Brother, you are in real danger," was what Lin Li really hoped to tell him. Actually, he felt really sympathetic for that group of adventurers. However, sympathy was sympathy, and rendering support was another matter altogether. Doing one's best to turn the tide of the battle required true abilities. If a level 13 magic shooter were to fight a level 18 magical beast, that was not helping, but digging his own grave. Lin Li was not that virtuous enough to be willing to sacrifice himself so foolishly for a bunch of strangers. Hence, he could only feign ignorance, and continue walking deeper into the woods. At that moment, the dark force that had been accumulating for quite a long time exploded suddenly. Instantly, there were plumes of black smoke spreading all over the place. From afar, it not only looked like black circular ripples, but also a black blooming flower. The moment he came into contact with the black fog, the warrior that charged at the front disappeared in a violent explosion. That was a real explosion, where blood and flesh splattered all over the place. That POM gave everybody goosebumps on their heads. There were also some fragments of armor among the splattering pieces. Despite having undergone the inscription process, the armor was as fragile as a piece of duckweed when it came into contact with the black ripples. "Death ripples," Lin Li exclaimed in shock. It was the legendary level 18 magic spell that not many archmages specializing in dark magic could grasp. He could not believe that he'd just witnessed that spell from a magical beast. **T. They were totally doomed. The shapeshifter was terrifying enough just with its mastery in dark force. Now that it was as proficient in the life-threatening death ripples, it made the beast before them even more horrifying. Not all shapeshifters had the ability to attack their opponents with the death ripples. How a shapeshifter was able to own dark magic was similar to a phantom panthera, depending on nature. The greater its innate qualities, the more advanced its dark magic. For a shapeshifter, its strengths were dependent on the amount of negative energy within its body. Thus, it would be based on the scale of the disaster it was created from. To create a shapeshifter that had the abilities to cast the death ripples, the disaster would have cost the lives of at least 10,000s. The thought of a 10,000 lives big bloodbath made Lin Li pause in his steps. He had a vague impression he'd heard about a wide-scale catastrophe. The depressing sound of a series of explosions echoed from the battlefield. In the blink of an eye, the few warriors who survived out of luck previously died under the attack of the death ripples. They were too close to the sudden strike of death ripples. There was no room for escape. At that instant, the battlefield saw a scene of bodies blown into pieces. The death ripples was spreading at top speed like a plague towards the mages. Within seconds, they would fall due to it. Then, the entire team would be annihilated. At this crucial moment, a beam of bright white light shot through the crowd, separating the black fog. In that moment, Lin Li could not help but become dumbfounded. He clearly remembered that he felt an underlying sense of pure holy energy from that shining glow of light. "Holy light!" Lin Li exclaimed. He was so stupefied that he went into a daze. It was a known fact that the Felon Kingdom was the kingdom of mages. It would be extremely rare to find anyone who had a holy occupation and was skilled enough to use the holy light to purify any shapeshifter. Since it was already difficult to hire a legendary mage to join the team, Lin Li found it unbelievable that among this group of adventurers, there was such a member with that sacred occupation. Although the death ripples was a level 18 magic, the spell that took it down was a holy spell that was at least level 15. Wait, that's not a divine occupation, Lin Li realized his mistake soon after. As the black fog dispersed, Lin Li saw clearly that it was only a silver plate that emitted the divine power, and not any divine occupation. The golden-haired youth gripped the silver plate tightly. His handsome face was covered with sweat. Anyone who saw that scene would have been petrified. No one could have thought that the powers of a shapeshifter would be so extreme, all thanks to the timing he used the sacred weapon. If he was late for a second, the mercenary corps he'd built up so strenuously would have been wiped off entirely by the death ripples. The sacred weapon was so valuable. It could overcome a level 18 magical spell with the shocking divine power within it. Unfortunately, that sacred weapon could only be used once. At the thought of that, a streak of disappointment was reflected in the eyes of the golden-haired youth. He'd brought his mercenary corps to the Nightmare Mountains to battle the legendary shapeshifter as he had gotten a hold of this weapon. From the day he'd acquired this sacred item, everything had been planned. They planned to let their warriors hold back the beast and their mages use the traditional attacking spells to weaken it bit by bit. When its powers had been weakened to the minimum, he would take out his sacred weapon and inflict the most critical blow. Unfortunately, luck was not on their side. They had miscalculated the fact that their opponent was a shapeshifter that would be skilled in the death ripples. Now that the sacred weapon had its powers drained, even if there was a strand of magic left, it would be hard for them to pose any threat to the shapeshifter. If they delayed any further, the entire team would be wiped out completely. The golden-haired youth made a decision. He raised the silver plate high up in the air. Under the blazing light, the light reflected off the plate was exceptionally dazzling. Retreat. What followed the command was another beam of light from the silver plate. The only difference was that this time, the light was much dimmer than before. The pure divine power shot out of the silver plate once more. But this time, it was not to ward off dark magic. It was to attack the shapeshifter, which had been releasing those death ripples. Even though that was only the remaining powers of the divine weapon, it had innately antagonistic properties against the dark ripples. The impact it resulted in was beyond what one could imagine. There was a bolt of dazzling white light that penetrated the body of the shapeshifter's body immediately. Dark red smoke gushed out of the wound of the beast profusely. To the shapeshifter that did not have a fixed body, these were like its blood, its energy source. Every time it escaped from its body, the beast would get weaker. Under that single strike, the shapeshifter had lost more than a quarter of its energy. If he were to use this weapon at the beginning, it would be almost impossible to deal with the monster. That weapon could only weaken it slightly when the over 30 adventurers charged to the front line in their respective batches, and even employed the flaming storm on it. Such a loss, the golden-haired youth sighed disappointedly. If only he was able to delay the attack by another minute. With just an extra minute, he would have been able to use that sacred weapon to inflict a deadly blow upon the level 18 magical beast. Unfortunately, it was too late. There was not enough power in the sacred weapon to kill anymore. That last strike only helped to agitate the beast further. Other than that, it was meaningless. Roar, the ear-piercing growl of agitation almost sliced through the eardrums of everyone. That was the first time that the creature got injured from the fight, causing it to reach extreme anger. The red light in its eyes became more prominent than ever, just as if blood was going to ooze out of them. The fire that surrounded the hooves grew even more threatening too. The mercenary corps had started to retreat. With the protection from the rest of the archers, the mages managed to exit the battleground. Before they arrived, they had already practiced the retreating drill countless times. Although they were at the losing end, they showed no chaos nor panic. The mages walked at the front, while the archers followed closely behind. If the warriors were still alive, that place would have belonged to them. The mercenary corps retreated like the tide. Yet, the eyes of the shapeshifter did not even glance at them, and remained fixed on the silver plate, the enemy that attacked it. What a waste, the golden-haired youth sighed as he looked at the silver plate in his hand. Then, he clenched his teeth, and threw out that weapon. The sacred weapon created a brilliant silver trace behind it as it flew over and descended into the thick growth. And while the silver plate was flying, the shapeshifter took its chance to flee. The fire around its hooves went away quickly together with it as it escaped like a gush of wind. Fuck! Lin Li cursed in shock. Never had he expected that the battle would end so abruptly, and that he'd still face the tragic consequence of it. The place where the silver plate fell happened to be Lin Li's hiding place. The legendary nightmare mount had a frightening speed. Before the silver plate even touched the ground, the shapeshifter had already dashed in front of the two men. That moment, Lin Li's hair stood up. He felt despair and absurdity, just as if he was knocked down by a train suddenly while sitting at home watching the television program. The train, no, the shapeshifter, was like a red bolt of lightning that struck Lin Li. Its dark red horn was like a hammer, knocking hard into Lin Li's waist. Retribution. This must be my retribution. At this moment, karma was the only thing that filled Lin Li's mind. He chose to be a passive bystander, and watched the mercenary corps fight to the death. It was the time for him to receive his retribution now, and die like how the other warriors did. A transmigrator being killed in a road accident, how absurd this is. Lin Li never felt so indignant. On the verge of dying, the only thing Lin Li felt like doing was to shout at the shapeshifter, "Fuck you, shapeshifter, it's time to get a driver's license." Mr. Fellick, are you all right? After closing his eyes from quite a while, he heard Sean's voice. Huh? Lin Li cried in doubt. How could Sean speak when he is dead? Then, he suddenly remembered he was attacked by the horn of the shapeshifter before this. Why did he feel no pain at all? Did the horn have anesthetic effect? Thinking of which, Lin Li opened his eyes. Then, he was stunned. The view before him was sheer absurdity. The culprit lied at his feet on the lush green grass. A faint scent of holiness emitted from it, and the ultimate killer, the shapeshifter, had vanished completely. At that instant, Lin Li did not know if he should cry or laugh. He thought he was definitely going to die, yet woke up with 0 injuries. The only thing that was amiss was that there was a small hole on his robe of wrath, located where the horn of the shapeshifter struck. This is too surreal. Lin Li could not believe his own eyes. He felt as if he was a serial killer who was apprehended by the police, but merely sentenced as a thief. Lin Li always wanted to hunt shapeshifters, how would he not be aware of the horn that struck him? That was the firmest weapon on earth, filled with the powerful dark magic which could break all protective realms. Not to mention that he was only wearing the robe of wrath, even if it was the thick and heavy armor that the warriors wore, he would not be able to block the harsh impact the horn inflicted on him. That sharp weapon struck him like a bolt of lightning, how would it only create a small simple hole in his body? But it was what made Lin Li felt like something was amiss. Don't tell me it's because of that? Lin Li muttered as an object flashed in his mind. The pocket of the robe of wrath was exactly where the horn of the shapeshifter struck on. Thinking of which, Lin Li reached into his pocket frantically. His fingers came into contact with that eerie piece of crystal. Although the surface of the crystal was filled with decorative patterns, the light it reflected was a sinister, dark red. When Lin Li first noticed it, he thought he had seen wrongly. Lin Li was absolutely clear that in that cave, the crystal was transparent. However, why did it show rays of dark red when they exited the cave? Soon after, Lin Li understood everything. That was because he smelled a familiar scent that came from that piece of crystal. One could forget the color of the crystal, but not its scent. Lin Li would never forget that unique smell belonging to a shapeshifter. This dark and pressurizing smell would only be emitted by these beasts born during suffering and disasters. God damn it. That shapeshifter got eaten by a crystal? At that point of time, the only term that came to Lin Li to describe the unbelievable scene was the word eaten. Lin Li held on to the crystal tightly on the way back to Alana. His expression was like Sean's in the daytime, he was in the same trance and absent-minded state. He even felt soft beneath his feet walking on the rugged mountain road, it was as if he was stepping on cotton. The night's experience was like a dream. A huge eternal adamantine vein, 3 astounding gemstones, and a piece of weird crystal that could devour even the shapeshifter. Just thinking about it made him feel unreal. So much so that when Lin Li left, he did not even notice that the golden-haired youth who should have fled was still standing in the camp with a pale face. Beads of perspiration fell from his forehead. Even the golden hair around his ears was dampened with perspiration. His body trembled as he looked at Lin Li as if he was looking at the most terrifying monster. He could not help being afraid. He had led a group of people, and they had fought the shapeshifter for half a night. How could he not be clear about the strength of the level 18 magical beast? That was a creature comparable to that of a legendary level. If it weren't for the sacred weapon they had in hand tonight, even an adventurer 10 times stronger than them wouldn't dare to challenge the majesty of the shapeshifter. However, such a magical beast had disappeared the moment it collided with the young mage. What kind of terrifying force was it? If such a powerful figure mistakenly thought he was hostile, who could return to Alana alive among the 30 adventurers present? He would swear to God if he could that it was all a coincidence, and that he was not at all hostile. Tossing the sacred weapons out at the last moment was part of the battle plan to attract the shapeshifter's attention, and to buy precious time for the whole mercenary team to escape. Under the cliff of the other side of the camp, the mercenary corps had already prepared 40 rope ladders. It would only take a breath's time for the surviving adventurers to escape. However, little did the golden-haired youth expect that there was a young mage hiding in the forest. When he discovered the young mage, the golden-haired youth knew things were bad. Once the shapeshifter surged forth, no one could ward it off. The raging shapeshifter would tear all living creatures to pieces. Not to mention such a young mage, even an archmage wouldn't necessarily be able to escape from death. The golden-haired youth was more or less guilty, having killed a man for no reason. But very soon, he realized that the shapeshifter was gone. It was neither killed nor defeated, it suddenly disappeared. A hallucination, this had to be a hallucination. The golden-haired youth refused to believe it, and rubbed his eyes hard. That was right, it really disappeared. The sacred weapon was still quietly lying on the grass, and the young mage was still standing there, but the horrible shapeshifter disappeared from the world in a flash. Shock was not enough to describe his feelings. The golden-haired youth stared at the place where the shapeshifter had disappeared for a full minute. Then he realized a very serious problem. What he had just done could be described as foolishness. No matter how one looked at it, perhaps it would be regarded as a deliberate provocation. Although the golden-haired youth knew that this was in fact an accident, he knew better than ever that such an outrageously powerful person would not be in the mood to listen to his explanation. Anril was such a world, only the strong were respected and qualified to speak. A level 12 warrior was like an ant in the eyes of such a powerhouse. The latter only needed one finger to crush him to death. In this world, who would listen to an ant explain anything? At this moment, the golden-haired young man was so frightened that even his heart stopped beating. Beads of sweat trickled down his forehead, and his whole body was soaked in cold sweat. It looked as if he was just fished out of the water. His fair, handsome face was full of despair. He looked at the powerhouse amongst the forest with fear and horror, waiting for his final judgment. Everyone's life and death were all between his thoughts. It was only a short span of 2 minutes, but the golden-haired youth felt as if it had been a year. Fear and despair filled his heart. The feeling of waiting to die was like being nibbled away bit by a monster, but he just couldn't do anything about it. After what seemed like an eternity, the last thing he had anticipated was for the other party to turn away and leave. The golden-haired young man couldn't believe his eyes. He'd never thought that the super powerhouse would let him go like this. When the other party's figure disappeared completely in the forest, the sense of relief made the golden-haired youth lose all his strength. He could not even wipe the sweat on his forehead. He stood there, dumbfounded, staring at the dark forest with dull eyes. And all of this, of course, was unknown to Lin Li. It was late at night when he returned to Alana, and he had a hard time getting into the gates of the Alana Guild of Magic. Before Lin Li could enter the gate, he was stopped by 2 mages on night guard. There was no other way out. This was not Gerosis, after all. No one knew Felik, nor his identity. The 2 mages on vigil, who were yawning away for most of the night, only knew that this was the Alana Guild of Magic, the heart of all magic in the Felon Kingdom. Anyone who wished to enter the guild had to be interrogated. As for what kind of interrogation, it would be determined by the identity of the other party. Unfortunately, Lin Li's identity was the kind that should be questioned carefully. A young trial mage, who was also from the countryside of Gerosis. Everyone knew he was a magic genius, but with no background. There were many marginal people in an awkward position in the Alana Guild of Magic. They had gotten rid of their status as mage apprentices, but it was difficult to make any further progress. Perhaps they would only be stuck at level 5 even at the end of their lives, so most of the time, they would be sent to do various chores, such as vigils. No one liked to be on vigil. They had to stand outside at the gate every night in the cold wind. As long as they were human beings, they would harbor some resentment in their hearts, which naturally had to be vented. Therefore, making things difficult for mages who returned late had become their best entertainment, and such entertainment could usually bring some benefits. In order to return to sleep earlier, mages were usually not stingy. They might offer a few words of flattery, or even a little gift. Of course, they naturally dared not find trouble with those higher-level magic shooters in the guild. Once they angered these pestilences, they would not have to be on vigil anymore. A magic spell that came down would banish them to the cemetery. The subjects of their spite were generally low-level mages in the guild. These people were not high in status as well. As long as they adopted a business-like attitude, in addition to subtle hints, they would be able to reap some benefits in the end most of the time. Apart from these low-level mages, the ones they liked to spite most were still the ones who came from other guilds for the trials. In particularly, the mages that had come this year were all young talents, and they had no background in Alana. This was a very complicated mentality, one of both jealousy and superiority. They were jealous of the other party's talents, yet they despised their guilds. Except for the Alana Guild of Magic, other guilds could only remain country guilds. "What's your name?" The man in charge of interrogating Lin Li was a middle-aged mage. He looked to be over 50 years of age, and was tall and lanky. He stood outside the guild hall in a black robe, looking like a black bamboo pole. "Felix. Where are you from?" "Gerosis." "What are you here for?" "To participate in the trial." "Why did you return so late?" "I had something to deal with." Lin Li frowned slightly. He was already lacking sleep, and had been through some ordeal for the day. Even if he was made of iron, he wouldn't be able to hold out as well. He had finally returned to the guild and wanted to go back for a good sleep, but did not expect to be hounded by this fellow. He was asking some boring questions over and over and over again. Anyone in Lin Li's place would probably be infuriated as well. However, the other party's attitude was all business. Though Lin Li was fuming in his heart, he did not show it on his face. He continued to answer another few more boring questions patiently. The middle-aged mage turned over the guild records. There was indeed a trial mage named Felix, who was also from Gerosis. Except, his leaving the guild tonight did not seem to be in the guild records. This discovery lit up the mage's eyes. The absence of a record meant that he had left the guild without the consent of their trial mentor. Plus, he had returned late. If he did not try to make things difficult for such a subject, then he had kept vigil for nothing for the past 10 years. The middle-aged mage's face hardened as he tried to make his expression look more dignified. "Felix from the Gerosis Guild, right? I've just read the guild records, but there's no record of your going out. What's your explanation for this?" Lin Li opened his mouth to explain, but the middle-aged mage spoke again in a disgusting, old-fashioned tone. "As a trial mage, you have seriously violated the rules of the trial by going out in private, and you had come back so late. It seems that Alana's nightlife has lost you. The country guild is a country guild after all, only capable of producing an unruly kid such as you. I tell you, if there's no reasonable explanation, I think I'll inform your mentor about it." When the middle-aged mage said this, he specially emphasized on the enunciation of the word explanation. Lin Li nodded his head, and understood at once. He thought it was business, but the mage was actually asking for bribes. On hearing this, Lin Li's face turned cold. "There's nothing to explain. If you have a problem, you can ask my mentor. His name is Macklin. You, the middle-aged mage never expected that this kid from the country guild would have such an outrageous attitude. He had seen many trial mages before. Even if he picked one from them casually, their background would be much deeper than that of Jerosis. What kind of place was that? It was Felon's most remote, most down-and-out guild of magic. It was said that several mage families had been riding on their heads in the past few years. A country kid who came from there actually had the guts to flare his temper on him? The two sides had dispensed with all civilities, and the middle-aged mage no longer wanted any bribes. He had decided to fix the kid's wagon. He shot a menacing glare at Lin Li, and said between clenched teeth, "All right, I will ask." As it happened. Before he could ask, Macklin came out on his own. Why hasn't he returned? Lin Li had been out for most of the night, and it nearly gave Macklin a heart attack from the panic. He was utterly regretful at present. If he had known earlier, he wouldn't have handed the kid over to Anduin and have his nerves kept on tenterhooks for the whole night. He was afraid something might happen to the kid. He was the Guild of Magic's only hope. If something wrong happened to him, was he going to make another intermediate blacksmith to deal with the bet? After the two of them had left, Macklin's fear grew with his thoughts. He had already come out for a dozen times in just a few hours, just to see if Lin Li had returned. In just a night's time, he could feel that he had grown a few more strands of white hair. Damn Anduin, that old bastard. Macklin walked down the steps and was about to look around the corner when he suddenly saw a young mage smiling at himself. The old mage robe, which was torn and worn, looked very cordial at the moment. The curse that he had uttered halfway was stuck at his throat. This kid is finally back. Mr. Macklin, Lin Li and the mage on vigil greeted almost concurrently. However, the Macklin at present had no time to care about a mage on vigil. He breathed out a sigh of relief, and began to reprove incessantly, "You kid, you know how to come back? Another half an hour, and I'd be going up to the Nightmare Mountains in search for you." "I didn't want to, but I had a small accident on the way." Lin Li's expression was listless, and he yawned after speaking. He was utterly sleepy. "I'll explain to you tomorrow. I have to go back to sleep now. Otherwise, I'm afraid tomorrow's trial mission will be done for." "Forget about the crap trial." Macklin rolled his eyes as he scolded him with exasperation. "In your present state, I could throw you into a heap of magical beasts, and you'd still fall asleep. Hurry back and sleep. We'll talk about the trial mission tomorrow afternoon when you wake up. I will personally wake you up then." "Oh." Lin Li nodded, and continued no more. He led Sean, who was also yawning unceasingly, past the middle-aged mage, who was standing with his eyes and mouth open wide, and went down the steps into the guild hall. Macklin heaved out a long sigh of relief, watching the two figures recede. The night's sufferings had caused him a few more strands of white hair. The middle-aged mage was regretting his guts out having witnessed this bizarre scene. A country mage with no background in his eyes turned out to be someone that even Mr. Macklin had to personally receive. He had been in the Atlanta Guild of Magic for more than 10 years, how could he not know Mr. Macklin's character? He was someone who dared to confront even President Aldwin. In these 10 years, he had never seen Mr. Macklin as gentle as he was today. Just listen to the conversation between them earlier on. In order to let the young mage have a good sleep, Mr. Macklin had spared no effort to delay the trial time. For a moment, the middle-aged mage felt his scalp tingle. "I'm done for. I might really end up guarding the cemetery." Fortunately, Macklin was unaware of the whole situation. He had come out at a later time, and had not seen the mage on vigil badgering Lin Li, nor did he know that the person he had been waiting for the whole night was held up by this fellow at the gate and was not able to enter the guild hall. Otherwise, with Macklin's character, the consequences were hard to imagine. Because he was in a good mood, before Macklin went back to the guild hall, he had even encouraged the middle-aged mage. Hearing the words of encouragement, the middle-aged mage felt his legs go weak. Cold sweat broke out continuously on his back, and even his voice seemed to tremble as he spoke. When Macklin left at last, the middle-aged mage was finally unable to hold out, and fell limply on the ground like a pool of mud. Lin Li brought Sean to his dormitory. Then, his head began to pound. Sean's snoring was something that he had got to know well. He was fine with it personally, he was deadbeat from the day's ordeal, and figured that he probably wouldn't wake up even when thunder struck. However, his two roommates were innocent. As soon as Sean's snoring sounded, they probably wouldn't sleep tonight. He stood outside the door and hesitated for a moment, but he could not think of a good way out of it. He could only ask Sean to restrain himself and get through the night first, then he'd help him think of other ways the next day. After making up his mind, Lin Li pulled out his key and opened the room's door gently. "Felix, you rascal, you're finally back." Who knew that he had just entered the living room when Mason's voice rang out from the bedroom. "I'm very sorry for disturbing your sleep, big brother Mason." Lin Li felt rather sorry. He had opened the door gently so as to avoid disturbing both of them when resting. He didn't expect Mason to wake up despite it. "I wasn't even sleeping." Indeed, when Mason came out of the room, it turned out he did not even take off his mage robe. He still looked very energetic. He pointed to the next door, and grinned lewdly. "I'm guessing that fellow's not asleep as well, you can take a look if you don't believe." "Felix back?" Mason's voice had just fallen when Oren's bedroom door opened. "MHM, I'm back." Lin Li nodded, but his expression was full of confusion. What are these two fellows doing in their room in the middle of the night instead of sleeping? "Felix, I heard you beaten up Archmage Darian's nephew." Mason gathered to Lin Li's side without even looking at Oren. The smile showed that he was totally up for some juicy gossip. "How do you know?" "Heh. I heard from others." "So, did you really beat him up?" "MHM, there was nothing to hide about such a thing." Lin Li nodded his head, and admitted it generously. "I practiced magic with him for a while." Mason rolled his eyes. He thought inwardly, it's not like I haven't seen that fellow ManhwaRecap before. He's only level 7, and is worlds apart in strength with me. "You monster, you went to practice with him? Aren't you sending yourself to death? Be careful these few days." Oren's words were few, but his concern could be heard by anyone. "MHM, I will." Lin Li also knew that the middle-aged mage named Darian had always harbored a strange hostility for him. Perhaps what ManhwaRecap did to Sean was also ordered by him. Now that he had crippled ManhwaRecap, it would be strange if he did not come to find trouble with Lin Li himself. Forget it, let's not talk about it anymore. If it was in the past, Mason would probably have advised him once more. But after seeing Anduin the day before, he finally knew how strong the kid's backing was. With the legendary mage standing behind him, who'd dare to lay a hand on him? It was just a casual mention anyway. Then, Mason's face revealed the lewd smile again, and he asked in a mysterious tone, "Did you all hear about the change in the trial mission tomorrow?" "What change?" Lin Li couldn't help but be startled. Why hadn't he heard Macklin mention about a change in the trial mission when they were outside a while ago? If you're enjoying my content, please consider donating a coffee. Or checking out my shirts on TeePublic. I heard from my uncle. Mason's opening remarks were still the same. Lin Li had heard him say the same thing at least 10 times in the past few days since he'd arrived in Atlanta, so much that Lin Li was curious who this uncle was, and how he was so well informed. Not to mention the major decisions of the guild, even some lace news and gossip could not escape him. Lin Li made up his mind that he'd have Mason introduce him to his uncle one someday. Tomorrow's mission will be beyond our imagination. Lin Li's interest was piqued. What's the mission that's so impressive? Mason's face stood to reason. I don't know. Lin Li was almost infuriated by him. He had been talking mysteriously for a long while, and in the end, it had finished with an I don't know. Where was the important part? The important part was gone. What was the difference between this and an eunuch? For a moment, even Oren couldn't stand it. Idiot without any professional ethics. Listen to my explanation. Mason quickly excused himself, seeing that he was about to offend the majority. Tomorrow's task is decided by the Supreme Council. Don't mention my uncle, even President Aldwin might not necessarily know. For real? The more Lin Li thought, the more puzzled he felt. Although the trial was initiated by the Supreme Council, the latter had not interfered too much. After all, there were countless guilds of magic in Amril. The Supreme Council might not necessarily have time to oversee Alana. What medicine had they mistakenly taken to take charge of the mission suddenly? What missions do you think the Supreme Council will issue to us? Mason was apparently excited. The thought of the Supreme Council's mission excited one easily. Devil knows. Lin Li pouted his lips. He had no awe for the Supreme Council. His headache at present was how to sleep tonight. Sean was already dozing over there. He was sitting in a rattan chair with his head leaning back. Lin Li reckoned that, in a short time, he would shock the whole building with his snores. Lin Li pondered, and had to wake Sean up. Sean, wake up first. After the day's ordeal, Sean was already worn out. Though he was shaken up by Lin Li, his eyes were still half closed as he asked in a daze, "What happened, Mr. Fellick?" "Sleep in my room." "How could I?" Sean woke up half in shock upon hearing this. He shook his head, and said, No, Mr. Fellick, I'll just sleep in the living room." "Cut the crap with me." It was no use discussing with this fellow. Lin Li's face stiffened, and he said in a commanding tone, "If you don't want to go back to Gerosis, go to my room to sleep." Sean dared not decline any more upon seeing Lin Li's hardened expression. However, he was still hesitant. Then, "Mr. Fellick, where would you be sleeping?" "I want to sit down a little longer. When I want to sleep, I'll come in and wake you up." With this remark, Sean finally put down his worries, and answered honestly, "ORH." Lin Li helped Sean to close the bedroom door, then sat back in the rattan chair. With a tired look on his face, he said to his two roommates, "It's not early anymore. Let's go to bed earlier. There's still the trial mission tomorrow." "You are good to him." Oren praised Lin Li, which was something rare, and then gently closed the door. Lin Li smiled, and did not give any explanations. He whispered in his heart, "I'm good to you too." Seeing that both roommates had closed their doors, Lin opened the Ring of Endless Storm once again, and took out a crystal pen and a bottle of star sand from inside. Then, he quietly laid a ward of secrecy on the doors. After all these, Lin Li could finally put his heart down and sleep. With the ward of secrecy as a shield, let alone Sean's snoring, even thunder couldn't reach the living room. Lin Li had been bone-weary from the day's events. Now that he had nothing to worry about, he slept soundly even in the rattan chair. It was not just Lin Li that slept well, but Mason and Oren too, as well as Sean, who was shielded with the ward of secrecy. While they slept soundly, someone was crying in front of Darien. It was Madrick, the unlucky brat who had hit a snag. Uncle Darien, Madrick lay on his bed, covered with bandages and looking like a mummy. A little movement from Madrick would affect his wounds and cause excruciating pain all over his body. "Shut up. You're a grown man, what's there to cry about with minor injuries?" Darien's face was livid, and he was frustrated by Madrick's cries. He already knew what had happened. Darien had never thought that the kid from Gerosis would have the guts to take such strong actions. Although he had said nothing to cry about, Darien knew very well that it was not a minor injury. In fact, he was startled when he saw Madrick's wounds. The body was covered with bruises, and the wounds on the legs were as deep and long as if they had been cut open by a knife. The trace of the flaming hands on the chest still exuded a strong burning smell. His back was even more horrible, almost half of his body was blown up, and even the ribs were exposed. Fortunately, Madrick was lucky enough not suffer injuries to the internal organs, otherwise, he would probably have died already. Madrick's injury reminded Darien of the trial many years ago. All this seemed to be a repetition of that year. Back then, he was lying on that bed in almost the same condition as Madrick at present. He was seriously injured, and had almost died. The man who did that to him was also from the Gerosis Guild of Magic, and his name was Jirian. Darien could not help gripping his fists at the thought of Jirian's disgusting fat face. It was the greatest shame of his life, being defeated in front of hundreds of people by a fat man whom he had never taken a look at before. Darien had never suffered such humiliation in his life. After an air bomb had defeated him, the fat man who deserved to go to hell spat in his face, and said, "If you have the strength, you can be arrogant too. Focus on healing your injuries. I'll deal with this matter." Darien took a deep breath, and tried to force down the years of hatred. "Uncle Darien, you must help me out." "I will." After Darien came out of the room, he did not look for Lin Li directly. Instead, he returned to the guild hall, went up the stairs to the second floor, directly to Aldwin's door, and knocked on it. "Why are you here?" It wasn't Aldwin who was asking, but Macklin, who was second to Aldwin in the Alana Guild of Magic. "Good morning, Mr. Macklin." Darien's voice was very respectful. He had always feared the man with the goat-like beard. Macklin was lacking in strength as compared to Aldwin, but at the Alana Guild of Magic, people who were afraid of Macklin were far more than those who were afraid of Aldwin. Although Aldwin was a legendary mage, even surpassing that of legendary level with his level 21 strength, he had always acted with the principle of generosity. He was a kind and wise elder in everyone's hearts. But Macklin was different. The goatee was a real pestilence. Darien was considered mild. Just look at the young mages in the guild, everyone saw Macklin as if having seen a ghost. However, today, Darien had to stand in front of Macklin even though he was afraid of him. The reason was simple: the man he feared most was the trial mentor of the Gerosis kid. "Darien is here?" While Darien was hesitating to open his mouth, Aldwin looked up from a pile of books. The old man had a gentle smile on his face, which was like a spring breeze to others. "Good morning, President Aldwin." After the respectful greeting, Darien took another glance at the book in the president's hands. It seemed to be written in the High Elf's print. "You've come to me so early. There must be something of the matter?" "Yes, President." Darien nodded his head, and showed some indignation on his face. "I shouldn't have bothered you so early, but unfortunately, a very serious matter happened in the guild last night. A mage who took part in the trial actually wounded Madrick, President Aldwin. I think it is necessary for you to take care of this matter." "Oh?" Aldwin paused slightly, and put his book back on the table. "Which guild is the trial mage from?" "From the Gerosis Guild of Magic. He seems to be called Felix." "You mean Felix?" Before Aldwin could speak, Macklin's eyes were already wide open. "Yes, Mr. Macklin." "Then take care of what CRA. Macklin, Felix trial mentor seems to be you?" Macklin was about to curse, but was stopped by Aldwin on the other side. "Yes, President Aldwin." "Then, great. You'll do as you deem fit." Okay, how could Macklin not understand when the president's hint was so obvious? The so-called do as you deem fit naturally meant to do nothing about it. "No kidding. Deal with Felix? You'll deal with it and see. If that old fellow Andoin flares up, are you going to pacify him or is Aldwin going to do it? Furthermore, after dealing with this kid, will you settle the bet with the Adventurers Guild for us?" "Darien, is there anything else?" Looking back at Darien again, Macklin suddenly felt that this fellow was seriously not pleasing to the eye. He cursed inwardly, "Damn it, can't you do anything right at such an age already? You only know how to find trouble for me." "Ah?" Darien was waiting for Aldwin to announce the solution, and was taken by surprise when Macklin asked him out of the blue. When he finally woke up to reality, he realized that the solution had been announced. The president had not even asked for his own opinion, and had given Macklin full authority to deal with it. "Why, do you not rest assured that President Aldwin has left this matter to me? Are you worried that I'll be biased?" Macklin looked at him with a vague, somewhat ill-intentioned look. "No, no." Darien was almost scared out of his wits upon hearing it. This was no joke. Even if he were given 100 times more guts, he wouldn't dare admit it before Macklin. For a moment, he was sweating buckets in fear as he shook his head repeatedly in denial. "Then, that's good." Macklin nodded in satisfaction. "Go back first. I will handle this matter." "Yes, Mr. Macklin." Darien dared not stay any longer upon hearing it. He'd be in trouble if Macklin had misunderstood him again. After saying goodbye to them, he respectfully left the room. "Heh heh, this Felix," watching Darian's receding figure, Aldwin chuckled helplessly. "This little rascal. He's only creating troubles for me. What do you think of this matter?" "What can I think?" Macklin shrugged his shoulders, and his face looked even more helpless than Aldwin's. "This little rascal is now my living ancestor. I can't fight nor scold him. I'm just short of paying tribute to him. Darian's nephew can only accept it as his bad luck. He could have provoked anyone, but he went for that fellow. It's his luck that he's not killed." "No." Aldwin shook his head. "I mean, what do you think of this Felix?" Macklin scratched his head. After mulling it over for a while, he choked out a single word. "Monster." "Oh?" Aldwin was slightly stunned. "How's that?" "This is a long story," Macklin sighed, and his face revealed deep emotions. "You know about yesterday's trial, right?" "MHM. I bet you'd never imagined what that kid did." Even Macklin couldn't help feeling sour when he recalled yesterday's trial mission. "That kid unleashed 2 level 2 instantaneous spells and 1 level 3 spell right under my nose." "Level 3 spell?" Aldwin was shocked to hear that. Level 3 instantaneous spell meant a strength of at least a magic shooter. This Felix might be a magic genius, but he was still young. He looked to be just barely over 20 years of age, so how could he possess strength close to that of a magic shooter? "Don't be surprised yet. I haven't finished," Macklin sighed, and then gritted his teeth. He said, and these 3 spells were released almost at the same time. The interval between the spells was only 1 second. Even with Aldwin's strength, he hissed as he took in a cold breath sharply, in spite of himself. What was the concept of 2 instantaneous level 2 spells and an instantaneous level 3 spell? Even among the archmages, perhaps there weren't many who could do it, let alone a young man who was only 20 years old. And then, this kid completed a breakthrough. Breakthrough to which level? Broke through from level 12 to level 13. How can it be? Aldwin's eyes widened upon hearing level 13. Even the pride of the Alana Guild of Magic, Gryffindor, who was also the #1 magic genius in the Felon Kingdom, was only 23-year-old when he broke through level 13, and that was also due to special reasons. How could this Felix from Gerosis be so powerful? He had already reached level 13 at age 20. When he reached the age of Gryffindor, wouldn't he be breaking through to the realm of Archmage straight away? If not, why would I call him a monster? A monster indeed. Aldwin shook his head as he sighed with emotion. "Oh, right," Macklin mused, and then remembered something. "There's one more thing you can't imagine." "What's that?" "If I'm not mistaken, this kid is most likely a pharmacist." "How do you know?" "I saw it with my own eyes." Anduin took out a bottle of potion to ask him for advice. "You didn't see the scene at that time, or you'd be dead from laughing. The old guy was like the apprentices from our guild in front of him, and was lectured till he dared not lift his head." "This is too." Aldwin uttered a few tooths in succession, but there was nothing that followed. Finally, he shook his head helplessly, and his eyes were full of incredulity. "In short, this kid is a real monster." Macklin concluded with this sentence, then squinted his eyes, and asked in a consultative tone, "I say, can you think of a way to get this kid to Alana? What future does he have staying in the countryside of Gerosis? Why don't you discuss it with Jirian? Will he come to Alana?" Aldwin's eyes lit up all of a sudden when he heard Macklin's words. If such a perverted genius could join the Alana Guild of Magic, he would not have to worry about having no successor. It was only a matter of time for a level 13 magic shooter at age 20 to break through to the legendary realm, not to mention he was still a pharmacist. Oh, right. He almost forgot, this fellow was a blacksmith who could forge magical equipment. "I didn't ask, but Alana is the capital of the Felon Kingdom. Our guild is 10 times stronger than Gerosis Guild. Why does he not want to come?" "It's hard to say." Aldwin shook his head, but was equally reluctant to give up. "But I'll try, let me find a way." 2 of the most powerful men in the Alana Guild of Magic, were in the room, engaged in a discussion. The target of their discussion was a young mage of only 20 years of age. They were so engrossed in the discussion that they completely forgot the time. It was almost in the afternoon when Macklin suddenly slapped his head, and exclaimed, "Oh, no, I forgot the business at hand." Then, he rushed out of the room without giving Aldwin an explanation. Like the day before, Lin Li was awakened by a sudden knock at the door. "Good morning, Mr. Macklin," Lin Li greeted Macklin with a sleepy face. "Why are you sleeping in the living room?" As soon as Macklin entered the door, he saw the two rattan chairs joined together and a blanket that had slid to the ground. Lin Li yawned, and used an excuse. "It's cooler in the living room." Macklin almost couldn't catch his breath. "What kind of mess is this? What month is it now to be sleeping in the living room, because it's cooler? Come on, hurry and tidy up. We must set off right away. Today's trial mission is a bit of a hassle." Time was running out, so Macklin did not ask further. Halfway through the conversation, he asked in puzzlement, "By the way, where are those two guys?" "Both sleeping. They stayed up too late yesterday. F***ck. These two loafers." Macklin's face darkened. Just as he was about to wake them up with an arcane missile like yesterday morning, the doors of the two rooms opened almost at the same time. When Oren and Mason came out of the room, their faces revealed some jollity. Fortunately, they were early today, otherwise, they'd have to receive 2 arcane missiles. "Very well. Luckily you've gotten up fast today." Time was too tight today, so Macklin did not have the time to lecture anyone. He merely shot a warning look at the two of them. "Pack up and go with me, your trial mission today will be completed in the Shadow Glen." "What?" Not to mention Mason, even Lin Li could not help but have his jaws drop. What kind of joke was the old man making? Was it somewhere that humans could go? Going to Shadowglen to complete the mission. This was like buying people's lives. That was the legendary heaven of the dead. It was full of the bones of the dead, and was covered with poisonous fog. Even if a cockroach were to crawl in, it would most likely turn into a corpse. "What joke is that?" Mason grumbled. He was here to participate in trial missions, not to sell his life. How was Shadowglen a place for humans? Mason would not want to enter Shadowglen as a human yet come out as a dried corpse. "I don't have the mood for jokes," Macklin exclaimed impatiently. Due to the nature of today's mission, Macklin had already bottled a stomach of anger. Yet that was the decision the Supreme Council. Even if he was unwilling, the only thing for him to do was to comply. Just when he had no place to vent his anger on, Mason came to him. Obviously, poor Mason became his punching bag, and got scolded harshly. "Do you think I want to bring you fellas to Shadowglen? God damn it, that was decided by the Supreme Council." Macklin shouted as the goat whiskers of his trembled uncontrollably. The finger he was pointing Mason with almost poked his nose. "If you are unhappy, go and look for the Supreme Council. No point ranting to me." "How would I dare to go?" Mason muttered under his breath before scurrying away. He would not want to provoke Macklin further. Macklin was in extremely bad spirits. Ever since he stepped out of the Supreme Council, he had been frustrated. To him, that mission had no point at all. How could the Supreme Council set the mission in Shadowglen? What if anything were to happen to these kids, especially Felix? He would get himself into hot soup. Not to mention the bet he made with the others. Anduin's existence alone was enough to cause a headache for Macklin and Aldwin. What was the relationship between Anduin and Felix? From their closeness, it did not seem like a mentor-student relationship to Macklin. Lin Li just walked silently, and did not think too much about it. After all, he had survived the Sunset Mountains, where he encountered all types of dangerous and vicious magical beasts, although not dangerous to the extent that they could certainly kill him. What he was more concerned about was the piece of crystal in his pocket. That crystal was too mysterious. There were no signs of magical waves. Even when its surface was covered with mage wealth inscription, it looked as if it was for decoration purposes. Lin Li could not detect any sense of energy from it, yet it was this crystal that swallowed a magical beast in front of his eyes. Lin Li was doubly sure that it really engulfed the beast. Before he went to bed yesterday night, Lin Li deliberately took a look at the crystal. He clearly remembered that when he was at the Nightmare Mountains, he had seen that the crystal emitted the exact magical waves as the shapeshifter. The magical waves was filled with the same viciousness and evilness, and the same depression and hopelessness. The thick and dark red waves were like thick red blood flowing within the crystal. When he held onto the crystal, he could clearly sense that the shapeshifter was inside it. It was quite surreal, but indeed authentic. Lin Li totally could not comprehend why such a powerful crystal would be buried underneath the mineral veins. This could not be explained by mere magical equipment. Even if Lin Li were to have all the materials needed for forging, he would not be able to create such a sick magical item that could engulf a level 18 magical beast. While walking, Lin Li made a silent decision: he'd find time to test out this piece of crystal when he returned from Shadowglen. If he were to understand and gain the strength of this crystal, nothing would be able to pose a threat to him anymore. After all, it could swallow a level 18 beast instantaneously, who would still need to use magic and physical strength against them. With that crystal, he would not need to fear any dragons, titans, or ancient magical beasts again. They could all be devoured by that crystal. With some uncertainty and some reverie, the journey to Shadowglen did not seem arduous to Lin Li at all. Shadowglen was filled with mountains, and was so secluded that even vicious beasts would not want to go near this legendary heaven of the dead. Yellow, withered weeds covering the ground were as though they were the aftermath of a fire. The gloomy pitch-black sky that almost never showed any sunlight instilled a sense of depression in the people. Cold wind continued to swirl those leaves up into the air, adding a sense of loneliness and chilliness to the atmosphere. Their journey to Shadowglen was as long as the time they took to the Nightmare Mountains. The four people reached Shadowglen in 2 hours by a coach. When Lin Li alighted from the coach, he could not help but feel dazed. He realized that there was a lot of tents of different sizes set up on the hills outside Shadowglen. There were also busy mages dressed in long black robes coming in and out of the tents from time to time. Among them, Lin Li spotted the 2 teammates of Matthias. What kind of situation is this? Mason looked at the tents and laughed heartily. It must be that the Supreme Council saw through our toil and sweat, so they are planning to organize an outing for us to relax. No wonder my uncle said that today's mission would be an unexpected one. Moron, Oren said as he walked past Mason, then added, only you would play in Shadowglen. Fad hopes you fella. Macklin laughed at Mason's anticipation when he alighted from the coach. You wanted to have fun? I'm afraid you might not even have the time to cry later on. Mr. Macklin, what's the situation? Why are the other teams? There's no choice. That's the instruction from the Supreme Council, said Macklin reluctantly as he shook his head. Today's mission is the same across all the teams. If you have any people you know who are here, you can go and say hi to them now, because there will be a lot of chances for you to meet each other in the next few days. Why is it a few days? Mason asked innocently. Fool! Macklin exclaimed as he shot him an angry stare, and asked, don't you see those tents? Do you really think that they are here for a holiday? At this moment, not to mention Mason, Lin Li could not help but feel surprised as well. He asked, Mr. Macklin, do you mean that we would be living in Shadowglen for a couple of days? Congratulations, you have guessed it correctly. There's no prize, though. How would Lin Li care if there were any prizes to be won? Before setting off, Lin Li had tried to predict the nature of that mission. To him, if they were going to go to Shadowglen, it would only mean that they were just going there to kill a few undead creatures. Frankly speaking, Lin Li was not serious about going to Shadowglen, as he felt that these undead creatures were not scary beasts. That was because he had at least 2 nemeses of the undead creatures in his ring of endless storm. But, when Macklin said that, he sensed that that was not the case. To live in Shadowglen for some days was not to be treated as a joke. Honestly speaking, this mission could be quite troublesome, Macklin said hesitantly as he understood the dangers of it. He continued, yet, there's only one thing that you need to do, stay in Shadowglen for a week. In these 7 days, you can do whatever you like or nothing at all. Of course, finding a hiding place for yourselves will be cool as well. But to me, there's nowhere safe to hide in Shadowglen. Aren't you talking crap? Lin Li pursed his lips. The undead creatures were not magical beasts. Time did not matter to them. They could be found wandering around, regardless of if it was day or night. It would be easy to find a hiding place, but whether they could escape from those creatures would be another matter. If any high-level undead creature were to see them, they would be in big trouble. Furthermore, the air in Shadowglen was poisonous all year round. If one were to stay in any spot for long, he would be in grave danger due to the huge amount of toxins he breathed in. Fuck the Supreme Council, a bunch of scoundrels. How would that be a mission? It concerns life and death. Mason cursed angrily, forgetting that it was Macklin that was standing beside him. It was rare that Macklin did not scold him this time. Macklin only took out 3 scrolls, and said, "It's also not very serious. For this mission, the Supreme Council prepared these scrolls for you. If you meet any danger, open the scroll, and you will be transported back to the camp." But, Macklin thought for a moment before advising, if you were to open the scroll, it would mean that you have failed the mission. So, think carefully before you give up on this opportunity. Okay. Oh, yes, let me add on. I was not joking just now. If you know of anyone here, grab this time to go and meet them. You might need them after you enter Shadowglen. Apart from his 2 teammates, how would Lin Li have any other friends in Alana? Although Macklin's advice was reasonable, it was not applicable to him at all. It was the same for Warren. With his cold and reserved nature, it was hard for him to have many friends. Mason, on the other hand, was a social butterfly. Right after Macklin advised them, a slight grin appeared on his face. He's right. Why didn't I think of that? Alright, I've said whatever I need to. The rest is up to you. After telling them all the tips and the rules of the task, Macklin walked off, feeling more at ease. Mason, someone called out from a distance. Lin Li could not help but feel relieved that Mason was in his team. He really was a social butterfly. The person who greeted Mason was a tanned and skinny young mage that looked about the same age as him. Behind him were 2 of his teammates, one short, another tall. When they walked together, it was full of comedic effect. Haha. Kayla, it was you? Mason seemed very happy that he met someone familiar. He waved to him excitedly while gesturing to his 2 teammates. Come here, let me introduce him to you. This fella is Kayla from Sunrise City Guild of Magic, and he's my childhood playmate. Kayla, these are my 2 teammates. He's Oren, and that's Felik. I'm happy to meet both of you. Kayla was obviously more mature than Mason. His speech and gestures were filled with propriety and politeness. After greeting the 2 men, he also introduced his teammates to them. The taller one was Lauren from Snow City Guild of Magic, while the shorter one was Fedric from Dawn City Guild of Magic. It had been long since he last met this childhood friend. Mason was so elated that he pulled Kayla over to chat for at least half an hour. Only when the mission was about to begin did he wave goodbye to him. When Kayla was about to leave, they promised to definitely render their help to each other if they were to meet any danger in Shadowglen, and to survive the 7 days together. Don't worry. As long as I'm there, you will be fine. Mason patted his chest, assuring Kayla. Then I'll depend on you in this mission, alright? Be assured, everything's on me. After making a pact, they continued to chat for a while, before Kayla brought his teammates away. While they chatted, Lin Li remained silent and sized up the tanned and skinny mage, curiously. Even to Lin Li, Kayla was a good mage of at least level 11, just a little weaker than Oren. His 2 other teammates were not weak too, both were at level 10, and much stronger than Mason. If they were to form an alliance with this team, it would definitely be of help for Lin Li's team to complete this mission. Unfortunately, even if he cherished the bond between the 2 teams, they might not have that same attitude. Underlying Lin Li's smile was a hint of sarcasm. This Kayla is an interesting man. When Kayla went back to his tent, the shorter mage, Lauren, asked him curiously, "Boss, you are very close to that mason?" "Just an acquaintance." "Then why did you treat him? Why was I so friendly to him, right?" Kayla said as he smiled and gazed at the entrance of Shadowglen. "Friendliness is free. If I treat him nicely now, he might be of help in the future. Furthermore, this mission will not be easy. Even if it was Gryffindor, there is no certainty for him to survive the 7 days himself, what more us. When danger arrives, it would be good for us to receive help from people instead of being backstabbed by them. But I'm afraid that the ability of that fella is..." The short mage paused, and thought for a while before continuing, "He is no more than a level 9, and his teammate, Felix, is just a level 7 dude. How could they be of any help to us in Shadowglen?" "What do you know?" Kayla glared at him impatiently. "In Shadowglen, luck is more important than ability. Don't be too full of yourself with that level 10 ability. I'll tell you that in Shadowglen, even if you are a level 11 or level 12, you might not be able to survive in this period of time. After all, friendliness is free. And it's good to have some scapegoats with us." But, after reprimanding the short mage, Kayla continued while in deep thought, "But that fella Felix, how could he dare to even participate in the trial with just a level 7 skill set? I'm sure he would be sent back from Shadowglen not long after the mission starts. We don't need to have much hopes of depending on that team." While the trio was conversing in the tent, an old and husky voice resounded outside. "Let me announce that the mission officially starts now. This time, I hope everyone can succeed and complete the task." Although the voice was not loud, it was strangely clear and easy for everyone to hear it. "Come, let's go." When Kayla and his team came out of their tent, Lin Li's team was already at the entrance of Shadowglen. The moment when Lin Li got close to the entrance, he sensed a pungent smell of rot. The putrid smell that filled the stale air resembled that of decaying corpses. Black haze filled their vision, and nothing could be clearly seen from any distance. The soil below their feet was moist and slippery. As they walked, it was as though they could hear the squelching sound of their steps. "This place is so disgusting," Mason cried out in disdain as he fixed his eyes at his feet, afraid of stepping on anything he should not be stepping on. There's no choice, because the undead are unaware of the environment in their habitat. "Oh, yes. Felix, aren't you a pharmacist? Are there any potions for us to go unnoticed by the undead creatures?" Mason always liked to daydream. To say the truth, when he was asking this question, he was not expecting there to be any. Who knew Lin Li would nod his head? He said in a definite tone, "Of course there are." "Huh?" Mason was shocked. Even Oren stopped in his tracks. "There is a type of potion made especially to deal with the undead creatures. If you consume a bottle of it, not only could you go unnoticed by them, but also gain divine power that would enable you to attack them with ease. So there's such a good thing in the world. Why don't you create some quickly? Our success depends on you now." "No problem," Lin Li nodded, and extended his arm to Mason. "Give me a stock of the divine flower, and I will help you create a few bottles of it instantly." F***ck. Lin Li's joke eased the tension in everybody's hearts. They walked along the curved narrow path, and before they realized it, they had reached the middle region of Shadowglen. That was the territory of the undead creatures. The black fog around them became thicker and thicker. Lin Li could hear vague rustling from the surroundings. It was the sound produced when a spring silkworm was devouring a mulberry leaf continuously. Amidst the cold chilly wind, the sound created goosebumps all over them. "Be careful," Lin Li reminded his teammates in a low voice as he grabbed onto his winter staff vigilantly. "Alrighty." Mason nodded. "But," he shrieked right after, "Ah." Lin Li glanced back immediately, only to see a few skeletal hands grabbing onto Mason's thighs. Mason's black robe was torn into pieces with a great force, and blood streaks appeared on his thighs. Sniff. Lin Li reacted immediately and raised his winter staff, and sent out wind blades. At that moment, there was a crisp sound of bones breaking, and an arm broke off from Mason. Under Lin Li's mind control, that wind blade took a turn, and proceeded to cut away another arm. Oren's staff was raised as well, but his mental strength was not as freakish as Lin Li. Although his reaction was fast, the speed of his spells was slower. When he shot out an icicle, Lin Li had already shot his second wind blade. In a split second, a series of crisp breaking sounds echoed, and the 4 or 5 skeletal hands that had grabbed onto Mason became a pile of bone fragments. God damn it, that was scary. Mason shook off those arms, and hid in a corner apprehensively. Don't just take a break, let's get rid of them first. Them? Mason froze, before realizing who they were. Under Lin Li's rapid recitation, the ground below the trio vibrated gently, black soil rose up into the air as though something was about to emerge from the earth. Large patches of soil raised with a burst of cackling sound. The scene of dozens of skeletal warriors breaking out from the soil made the 3 people hiss in a cold breath. Rusty machetes and the flickering will-o'-the-wisp filled the atmosphere with gloom and horror. Bloody hell, Mason's face went sickly pale in an instant. He only felt chill on his back as if a gush of cold wind had just blown past. It was in the center of these dozens of skeletal warriors where he was caught by his calf earlier on. If not for his 2 teammates, who were quick enough to rescue him in time. Looking at how these dozens of skeletal warriors flocked up, not to mention a level 9 mage like him, even a level 9 warrior would inevitably be cut to pieces. Luckily, living in a room with these 2 guys was really the wisest choice he had made. He was secretly rejoicing when Oren's cold voice came from behind. Idiot, stop spacing out. Mason looked back and shot a glare at Oren, but did not swear at him. Instead, he began to recite his spell. He knew that the dozens of skeletal warriors had to be dealt with immediately. There were countless undead creatures in the Shadow Glen, no one knew what was hidden in the dark. The longer the fight lasted, the more dangerous the situation of the 3 men would be. Boom! A muffled sound of explosion spread far away. Lin Li's flaming storm had taken the lead. Countless fire dragons cascaded forward, instantly engulfing a large number of skeletal warriors. Almost at the same time, Oren had finished his recitation of the Flame Nova. 2 powerful fire spells exploded consecutively among the skeletal warriors. In an instant, there was a blaze of firelight, and nearly 10 skeletal warriors were blown to pieces, before they could even lift their weapons. Mason had gotten the message after the 2 powerful magic spells were released by Lin Li and Oren. Without waiting to be reminded, he unleashed an ice armor spell, which was firmly propped up before the 2 of them. Skeletal warriors were not real warriors, after all, they were merely the lowest of undead creatures, and did not have the ability to think independently. As a matter of fact, the layer of ice armor unleashed by Mason could not completely protect his 2 teammates. If it were other magical beasts, they'd have circled around it and attacked from the back. However, these mentally retarded skeletal warriors only knew how to wield their machetes and slash haphazardly, leaving the rusty machetes to crack upon contact with the ice armor. So, that the thin layer of ice armor actually won them a significant amount of time. When the skeletal warriors finally split the ice armor, they were greeted by another bombardment of magic spells. All 3 of them were powerful, and had tacit understanding among them. The skeletal warriors, the lowest of the undead creatures, could not possibly pose much threat to them. The battle was over now, so to speak, but, in the Shadow Glen that was infested with undead creatures, no one dared to relax even the slightest bit. Lin Li tightened the nerve in his head. While concentrating on unleashing the spells, he had to divert some attention at the same time to monitor cautiously the movements around him. Thus, nobody noticed that every skeletal warrior seemed to release a wisp of black mist when it fell. It seemed to have been attracted by some mysterious force, drifting towards Lin Li. The direction of the flow was the pocket that contained the weird crystal. If Lin Li took out the crystal now, it would be very easy to notice that the pale maroon in the crystal was becoming stronger and stronger with the flow of black mist. Boom! The last skeletal warriors fell too at last. Lin Li had ended the battle with a fireball. Let's get out of here first. There was a tinge of uneasiness in Lin Li's voice. He constantly felt that there was something wrong with the skeletal warriors. They had been buried underground for countless years, and did not surface at all until they had passed by. It made him feel as if he was falling into a trap, as if something was peeping at him secretly, laying a trap and waiting for him to step on it. MHM. Mason and Oren, though at odds with each other, had a surprising similarity. They had an almost instinctive trust in their teammates, who had claimed to be a level 7 mage. Their trust in him had reached a blind extent, especially after the trial in the Nightmare Mountains. Like at present, after Lin Li had spoken, they did not even question, nor did they hesitate to follow, because they believed that since Lin Li had said so, he had to have his own reasons. But this time, their guess was wrong. In fact, Lin Li had no reason at all. It was his subconsciousness telling him to leave the place and extricate himself from the feeling of being peeped at. He kept having the sense that there was something wrong with this place. The dozens of skeletal warriors seemed like a trap that had been placed there for a long time, waiting for someone to step into it. The terrain was extremely complex in the Shadowglen, and the road ahead was filled with poisonous fog. Walking on this winding path was like walking into a labyrinth. There were fragments of bones everywhere, some scattered on the roadside, some deeply buried in the ground, and were all emitting a strong odor of decay. A gloomy atmosphere surrounded him. There were no other sounds at all apart from the trio's rustling footsteps. In the dead silence, even the air seemed to be solidified. Lin Li was controlling a warlock's eyes all the time as they were absorbed in navigating on the winding path. He controlled this small ray of light with his powerful and incomparable mental strength, and it moved rapidly within a few dozen meters square of the surrounding area. Lin Li's plan was simple: he'd find a place safe enough to get through the night. The Shadowglen, invaded by darkness, was not a place suitable for playing. Many high-level undead creatures liked to wander at night. Nobody knew what was hidden in the darkness. If they encountered a few high-level vampires, it would be too late for them to cry. The first night was always the most dangerous. First, they were unfamiliar with the terrain of the Shadowglen. Second, they were unaware of the distribution of the undead creatures. Besides, they were unprepared due to the rush. Once they encountered danger, they wouldn't be able to respond at all. Lin Li was of the opinion that most of the trial mages would probably be sent back tonight. If they wanted to spend the 7 days here in safety, they'd have to get through tonight first. But, it was not easy to find a safe place in a hurry. It took Lin Li almost an hour to walk through the path. Watching the sky darken gradually, they finally spotted a small cave. The cave was situated just below a cliff, and was quite well concealed. It did not look very deep from a distance. The walls of the cave could be seen at a glance. Moreover, it was quite dry inside, completely different from the damp and slippery feeling outside, and outside the cave, a tuft of withered and yellow weed could even be seen. Weed, what a rare thing to see in the Shadowglen. So, Lin Li had chosen the cave at the first glance. Still, in order to be more on the safe side, he released a warlock's eyes, and searched every place within 100 meters of the cave. "We'll stay here for the night." Lin Li's face showed some satisfaction when he retrieved the warlock's eyes. The cave was really good. There were no signs of undead creatures within 100 meters. This was simply something unthinkable in the Shadowglen, where the undead ran rampant. Since Lin Li had said so, Mason and Oren naturally had no objection. Besides, the cave environment was really good. Let alone tonight, they wouldn't have any objection if they were to live here for the next 7 days if possible. After a discussion, the 3 men decided on a simple division of labor. Mason took out his sleeping bag and blanket from his backpack, and arranged a temporary dwelling. Oren set up a bonfire in the cave. Meanwhile, Lin Li took out the crystal pen from his pocket, then dipped it in the navy sand, and laid out 2 magewefts at the mouth of the cave. One was the mental protection field, which could not only be used to ward off mental spells, but also to protect against eidolons ones such as ghosts. Before they became resentful souls, ordinary ghosts would not be able to pass through the mental protection field. Another was the seal of life, used specially to shield the scent of life of the 3 guys. High-level undead creatures were the most sensitive to living people, the vampires especially so. A small trace of life was like an endless temptation for them. In the Shadowglen, where the undead ran rampant, this seal of life was essential if they did not want to be discovered by the higher-level undead creatures. After the two magewiths were completed, the bonfire was ignited by Orin as well. The three guys, wrapped in blankets and leaning against the cave wall, which was heated by the fire, all felt a sense of drowsiness. Good night. Lin Li wriggled into his sleeping bag, and soon fell asleep. All three of them slept very soundly amidst the soft snoring, and none of them noticed that there seemed to be a slight maroon flickering in the light of the fire on Lin Li's body that was covered with the blanket. Lin Li, who was sleeping soundly, seemed to hear a slight noise. It sounded like a spring silkworm gnawing on mulberry leaves. The rustling sound continued on, and made Lin Li extremely annoyed, but he was reluctant to get up from the warm bed. He merely frowned, and muttered two meaningless words in his mouth. Help! It was not until a scream rang out that Lin Li suddenly woke up from his dream. He sat up from his blanket almost unconsciously, staring out of the cave with his eyes fixed and his ears straining in the direction of the sound. Save us! Just as Lin Li sat up, the voice rang again. Judging from the voice, it seemed to be a young man in his 20s. It's the mage who participated in the trial. Lin Li quickly turned over, and shook his two sleeping companions vigorously. Quick, wake up, it seems that someone is in trouble. Felix, what are you doing? Mason rubbed his eyes with his hands, and reluctantly emerged from the blanket. It's in the middle of the night, can't you let me sleep in peace? Orin did not speak, but his eyes were full of confusion. It looks like someone is in trouble. Let's go out and have a look. Hell, Mason complained reluctantly, but eventually climbed out of his warm bed. As he walked out of the cave, Mason looked at Lin Li with some doubt. It isn't right, Felix. You are usually not so enthusiastic. What benefit did that guy give you? I am such a person in your eyes? Lin Li stared at Mason fiercely, but he couldn't help feeling guilty inwardly. To be honest, he was really up to no good at present. It was not a big deal to help a lame dog over a stile, but in the Shadow Glen, a dangerous place where the undead were rampant, Lin Li had no interest in meddling with other people's business. He could put himself in danger instead of successfully helping the other party. Besides, all trial mages had the teleportation scroll with them. They could return directly to the camp if they had encountered any danger. There was no need to struggle desperately and disrupt other people's dreams in the middle of the night. Lin Li wanted to go over because he wanted to know what trouble the team of trial mages had encountered. That was the most important thing. The sound came from somewhere very near them, just a few dozen meters outside the cave. Lin Li remembered clearly that he had conducted a thorough search with the warlock's eyes before. Laying down the two magewiths, there were no signs of undead within 100 meters. This meant that either he had overlooked them somewhere, or that something suddenly appeared in the middle of the night. Anyhow, it was not a good thing. Lin Li felt uneasy and scared. He was even grateful to the unfortunate trial mages. If they hadn't appeared, it would be him calling for help at present. He had just walked out of the cave when he saw a fire ablaze not far ahead. It was the rays of the flaming storm. The rumbling muffled sound came with the rays, followed by another scream. Help! F***ck. Mason spat, and cursed, crudely. Don't they know how to use the teleportation scroll? They had to shout for help in the middle of the night, *tch. Let's go over and have a look. With the light of the flaming storm leading the way, Lin Li could save on using the illuminating spell. After all, this was the Shadow Glen, a little light might also attract the undead. The three guys walked along the steep hillside, and quietly groped their way in the direction of the scream. A few dozen meters was only a short distance for them. Before the light from the flaming storm had disappeared, Lin Li saw several figures leaning against the hillside. They looked very young, and wore the black robes of the Guild of Magic. It seemed that they were indeed the mages from this trial. One of the young men, a long-haired youngster, had already suffered some injuries, blood gushed out from the wound, and dyed red a large area on the mountain walls behind him. The other two companions were also in a bad situation. Although they held their magic staffs tightly, the magical waves that emitted from them were extremely weak. Lin Li estimated that their mana had already been more or less exhausted. A dozen meters ahead of them, a large group of skeletal warriors, with rusty machetes in their hands, was approaching them step by step. Mason's eyes were wide open, and he held back for a long time before he finally uttered, "This is too fake." Mages who are taking part in the trial are forced to shout for help by a group of skeletal warriors. Are they still seeing themselves as mage apprentices? Idiot. Warren glared at him and pointed his staff behind the skeletal warriors. Look what that is. Behind the large group of skeletal warriors stood the same deathly white skeleton. There was the same will-o'-the-wisp, but what was in its hands was not a rusty machete, but a skeleton staff inlaid with a huge magical crystal. Its aura was different from that of the skeletal warriors. It was powerful and mysterious, filled with a strong deathly aura. Fuck. Hell ghoul. Mason gave a start of fright. It was also a skeleton, but the skeletal warriors were no more than level 5, while for the hell ghouls, the weakest were no less than level 10. The strongest of them might even break through to level 15, and regain their bodies to become true liches. And in this shadow glen, the power of the hell ghoul could be maximized. They were born manipulators of skeletal warriors. They could control hundreds and thousands of skeleton legion with only one spell. These few fellows are really unlucky. If they weren't unlucky, it would be us who'd be unlucky. Lin Li was speaking the truth. With the keenness of the hell ghoul to magical elements, it was almost logical for them to find the two mageweths. When the time came, they'd be trapped in the cave, with hundreds of skeletons pouring in. The best way out would be to teleport back to the camp using the scrolls they had. While the two guys were whispering, the staff in the hands of the hell ghoul flashed again. The light from the skeleton staff glowed brighter and brighter, bringing the already precarious situation to an extreme. Lin Li seemed to have heard a continuous whoosh. It was the sound of a large number of skeletal warriors stirring. The surrounding earth was slowly loosening, and deathly white skeletons slowly crept out of the ground one after another. The skeletal warriors that were approaching steadily increased from tens to hundreds in an instant. At that moment, the numerous deathly white skeletons and their rusty machetes exuded a depressing aura of death in the dark of the night. The battle that came after could be described as a dying struggle. Facing an almost impossible-to-defeat enemy, the three trial mages chose not to teleport, but to recite their spells. Among them, the injured long-haired youngster was the strongest and had the most sufficient mana. He undertook the attack role almost alone. His two teammates had exhausted too much mana, and had no ability to attack at this time. They could only use some low consumption spells such as the delaying spell and the spell of frost to provide some assistance to their teammates. Despite suffering some injuries, the real strength of the long-haired youngster was not weak. For a moment, he was killing with bravado with the full support of his two teammates. He unleashed one lethal spell after another, and wiped out more than a dozen skeletal warriors in a flash. But on the other side of the battlefield, the summoning of the hell ghoul continued. A steady stream of white bones rose from the ground. Every dozen of skeletal warriors that fell was replaced with another dozen of skeletal warriors. This was the most terrifying aspect of the undead. They were not afraid of exhaustion at all. The endless cannon fodder could slowly nibble at any enemy. Faced with an endless sea of corpses and bones, even a legendary mage would have their mana exhausted. Lin Li had seen through the strength of the trial team ahead, 2 level 8 mages who had exhausted their mana and 1 injured level 9 mage. It would have been extremely difficult to confront a large number of skeletal warriors with such a force, not to mention the addition of the hell ghoul. Unless they were able to kill the hell ghoul instantly, the skeletal warriors it constantly summoned would be enough to send the 3 back to the camp. From the current situation, perhaps this only way would not be feasible as well. Under the siege of the large group of skeletal warriors, they would not be able to fly out even if they had wings, let alone kill the hell ghoul. Why are they not teleporting? Lin Li was puzzled. The strength of the two sides was not at the same level at all. Even a blind man could see that there was no chance for them, so, what were the fellows thinking? Did they think that continuing the trial mission was more important than their own lives? They were probably scared silly, Mason mumbled softly. Idiot, would you still recite a spell if you're scared silly? Mason was rendered speechless at Orange chide, but this fellow had a thick skin. Even if he knew he was in the wrong, he still had to say something. Maybe they are gifted. Go and die. The two guys were bickering when situation of the battle ahead suddenly changed. The long-haired youngster began to recite a long spell under the protection of the spell of frost. The power of this magic spell far exceeded that of those he had used previously. The surrounding magical elements seemed to surge in an instant. Even the three guys who were peeping in the distance could clearly feel the power of the spell. He's going to give it his all, Lin Li shook his head. The more powerful this spell was, the more mana it consumed. Even if the long-haired youngster had reached the strength of a level 9 mage, his mana would inevitably be exhausted following the release of the spell. Say. Shall we help him? Mason was slightly hesitant. We must help, Lin Li said with certainty. The smile on his face was rather weird. But we have to choose the right time. The reason why Lin Li made such a decision had nothing to do with helping a lame dog over a stile. This fellow was used to being selfish. Even if he had decided to help at this time, it was almost entirely out of selfishness. From Lin Li's point of view, the Hell Ghoul had to be destroyed sooner or later. Otherwise, if it was allowed to wander around in the vicinity, it would only be a matter of time before the cave they were hiding in was exposed. It'd be better to take advantage of the fact that someone was stalling it now. They could finish it off with one strike when the time came, or they'd have to confront the enemy and deal with the skeletal warriors it summoned at the same time. It'd be too much trouble instead then. However, they'd have to look at the situation before showing their hands. It was definitely not the right time at present. Numerous skeletal warriors were crammed there. It was enough trouble just to blast a way through with a spell. Furthermore, they'd have to deal with the other undead creatures that it constantly summoned. They'd have to wait. When's the right time? Of course it'll be at the most crucial time. Just as they were talking, the spell recitation of the long-haired youngster was drawing to a close. The surging magical elements burst into full swing. A bone-biting chill filled the surrounding air as countless snowflakes drifted down from the sky. A cold wave swept wildly through the group of skeletal warriors, freezing at least a dozen of them in an instant. After the snowstorm, the mana of the long-haired youngster was completely exhausted. Lin Li could clearly feel that the magical wave from him was even weaker than the other two. In fact, this was a good opportunity to kill the Hell Ghoul. Most of the skeletal warriors had been frozen, and the summoning of the Hell Ghoul had just come to an end. If the long-haired youngster had the strength to spare, a few instantaneous spells would do the job. Even if it couldn't kill the Hell Ghoul, it could probably deal a heavy blow to it. Unfortunately, after barely releasing a snowstorm, the long-haired youngster could not even lift his hands, let alone release any magic spells. He could only watch helplessly as the opportunity slipped from his hands. Now's the crucial time. As soon as Lin Li uttered the words, the fireball in his hands had been fired with a blast. Boom! When the huge fireball hit the Hell Ghoul, the dull reverberation seemed to shake the earth. The three of them had cooperated for so long that they had fostered enough tacit understanding long ago. Before Lin Li's fireball was fired, his two teammates had already begun their recitations. When the fireball burst open, and the splendid flames spattered, the two guys had finished their spell recitations consecutively. In an instant, countless blazes rose up. These two fellows had chosen the flaming storm without prior agreement. But, after all, Mason was only a level 9 mage. His casting speed was far slower than Oren, a level 11 magic shooter. Although they had started reciting at the same time, the release of his flaming storm was more than a second later than Oren. F***ck. Mason also knew that this short second signified a huge disparity. The fellow had cursed in anger as soon as the flaming storm was released. This fellow did have some indignation. He thought that he could be considered the cream of the crop with his level 9 strength, but didn't expect to meet his two teammates, one a powerful level 11 magic shooter, and another a freak through and through. He could not even make out the truth about the latter's strength. He was lucky not to be driven out of his mind under such harsh survival conditions. The long-haired youngster had frozen almost all the skeletal warriors with his snowstorm. For a while, there was no summoned creature to share the damage with the Hell Ghoul. The Hell Ghoul was blown to pieces after a round of bombardment by the three guys. Innumerable sparks shot up at once, and scattered bones fell all over the ground. The magical crystal on the skeleton staff fell, and rolled over several times on the ground. This sudden turn of events frightened the trial team. The three of them stared at the bone fragments with a glazed expression on their faces. The scene before them was too bizarre. It was like a rape case in which the victim struggled desperately but was still stripped of her clothes. As she was ready to close her eyes for enjoyment, she suddenly found out that someone had castrated the rapist. All three of them looked at Lin Li at the same time. They wondered who had castrated the rapist, who had killed the Hell Ghoul. Lin Li paid no heed to these doubtful looks. He was currently busier than anyone else. Undead creatures carried magical crystals as well, but these magical crystals often possessed powerful death energy. Ordinary mages could not use them at all. Only Lin Li, who was well versed in all 5 series, could make the magical crystal of the undead creatures become the same, or even more powerful, as that of a magical beast through a special treatment. Damn! Why does it not have it? Lin Li searched around the area where the Hell Ghoul exploded, but he never found the magical crystal he had imagined. It was almost impossible. An undead creature like the Hell Ghoul, which had reached the strength of level 10, should leave behind a magical crystal after being killed in any case. Eh? Lin Li was looking around when he found something strange. It was a wisp of black mist, clearly visible in the bright light of the fire. The pale black mist was rising from the place where the Hell Ghoul had exploded. It was like a black ribbon, winding around in the night sky, then finally surging forth to himself like a stream of water. The place where the black mist went was the pocket with the crystal. For a moment, Lin Li felt an inexplicable puzzlement. He was almost driven mad by this crystal in the last 2 days. Ever since he had gotten this crystal, weird things had been happening one after another. First, it had devoured the shapeshifter in the Nightmare Mountains. Now, it was absorbing black mist in the Shadow Glen. He did not know what the black mist was, but he could vividly feel a strong death aura from it. The peculiar aura specific to the undead creatures made Lin Li feel uncomfortable. He wanted to know what the hell this crystal was. Snip. While Lin Li was wondering, there was a sudden whisper in his ear, followed by a scream. Be careful. Lin Li was a little stunned at first, then, he suddenly remembered that he had just looked for the magical crystal of the Hell Ghoul, but had no time to clean up the skeletal warriors that were frozen by the snowstorm. However, it was not too late to clean up now. Lin Li cast a hastening spell on himself, and withdrew promptly. He had retreated a dozen steps before he began his recitation, all the while keeping an eye behind him. Dozens of skeletal warriors had been freed from their shackles, and were approaching Lin Li with their machetes amongst the shattered ice. But now that Lin Li had discovered their existence, how could he possibly give them the chance to approach him? As he turned around, a shot of infernal flare exploded among the skeletal warriors. Oren, who was behind him, did not hesitate to release an air bomb. Mason's recitation was swift. Without waiting for Oren's air bomb to explode, he had already laid a spell of swamp under his feet. In an instant, air bubbles surfaced, and the wet and slippery land turned into a swamp. The skeletal warriors were really stupid, so big a swamp was in front of them, but they had just stepped into it without even looking. The swamp had become crowded in a little while. A large group of skeletal warriors fell into the mud, waving their machetes as they struggled clumsily and slowly. This was simply a natural target. Furthermore, it was a fixed target, which couldn't even move. Lin Li had earned much experience hitting targets like this with his hunter background. It took less than 5 minutes and a dozen bombardment of spells to blow the skeletal warriors off the swamp. Oren was not idle at all at the side. While Lin Li stood there, hitting the fixed targets, he was hitting the moving targets right beside. Because of the limited space, the skeletal warriors that had no chance to fall into the swamp had all fallen victim to him instead. The 2 magic shooters were wreaking havoc, while others were just onlookers. It was not because they did not want to interfere, but because they did not have the ability to do so. The targeted skeletal warrior was obliterated by the two of them before the spell recitation could be completed. How could they step in? It was more likely for them to step out. The scene was witnessed by the long-haired youngster, and it terrified him. The hell ghoul that forced him at the end of his rope was obliterated by them in seconds. It was as easy as eating and drinking for them to clear up the skeletal warriors. Were these monstrous fellas really mages participating in the trials? This team could only be described as abnormal. A level 9 mage and a level 11 magic shooter were already terrifying. Unexpectedly, there was another fiend that looked like a level 7 mage, but he had displayed the strength that was stronger than the level 11 magic shooters. The infernal flare released just now had blasted away more than 10 skeletal warriors. The barrage of magic that followed was even more monstrous. It blasted all of the skeletal warriors in the swamp into smithereens. Was a level 7 mage really capable of such a feat? The long-haired youngster got more scared as he looked on. By the time the two of them had blasted more than 100 skeletal warriors into bits and pieces, both of his eyes were opened wide like a cow's eyes. Who are these people? The long-haired youngster swallowed hard. He looked at those three as though he was looking at three demons. Even as he spoke, he stuttered. Thank you. You're welcome. Lin Li smiled humbly. As long as he would not be in harm's way, he would be very brave and willing. Anyhow, the long-haired youngster had the skeletal warriors under control. He was willing to kill the hell ghoul as it was convenient. It was advantageous to him. Furthermore, he could get some good reputation. Who would not be willing to do that? Of course. If the hell ghoul was something like a high-leveled vampire or a death knight, Lin Li would not be so willing. These level 17 or 18 undeads were not going to be killed with a single spell. It would be a joke if they got raped instead of killing these monsters. Regardless, this instance of help had been very successful. The few surviving mages in the trial had no idea how cunning Lin Li was. From their perspective, this young mage was a role model. He had thrown away his safety to save others, emitting a selfless noble quality. Instantaneously, the feeling of gratitude was overbearing. In the midst of these three's gratitude, Lin Li naturally gave himself a pat on the shoulder. With the status of a benefactor, he had answers to whatever questions he asked. Of course, Lin Li did not ask too much. He only wanted how the three of them met a hell ghoul. We were too unlucky. The long-haired youngster looked unusually sad and angry. Since they had been woken up, Lin Li's group was not in a hurry. They found a place to sit and listened to the long-haired youngster's resentful account. The long-haired youngster's name was Larry. He was from the Mariana's Guild. He was a level 9 mage as well, but he was not as lucky as Mason. Mason's luck was really good, for he found two powerful teammates. This trial could be considered smooth sailing as they completed both missions splendidly. Even the nitpicking Macklin could not find an issue with it. On the contrary, Larry had worse luck. Both his teammates were level 8 mages, and they were the weakest in this trial. With the exception of the level 7 Lin Li, they were of the lowest level. A team comprising 2 level 8 mages and a level 9 mage trying to complete a mission would end in a tragedy. In the past few days, they did not even complete one mission. If they were unable to attain good results in the Shadowglen, they would not have the right to participate in the finals. Lin Li somewhat understood after listening to this point. It was not surprising that they refused to use the teleportation scrolls even under those dangerous circumstances. This mission in the Shadowglen was their last chance. After mentioning this matter, Larry could not help but feel resentful again. Larry knew that his team was too weak, so he decided to hide from the start. Since this mission was rated based on time, they would be able to get more points by hiding for one more day. If they were at the peak of their luck, and able to hide for more than 7 days, the points solely from this mission would allow them to participate in the finals. Unfortunately, luck was not on their side. They almost did not pull through the first day. After entering the Shadowglen, Larry immediately went to look for a hiding spot. In fact, he was skilled in this aspect. From the outskirts of the Shadowglen, he carefully dodged the undead. He actually entered the central region of the Shadow Glen without encountering danger. After that, he chose the same route as Lin Li. Both of them used Warlock's eyes to advance, and both chose the cave beneath the cliff. But their meeting was of a very different setting. 3 of them carefully advanced before painstakingly arriving near the cave. Yet, they unknowingly encountered a hell ghoul straight away. At this point, Larry thought he was going to die. Other than blaming himself for being unlucky, he was speechless. While searching with the Warlock's eyes, there were no signs of the undead. However, they bumped into a hell ghoul the moment they advanced. Where did you bump into it? Lin Li was slightly curious. It was near the cave. Larry pointed with his finger. The location he was referring to was about 10 meters away from the cave. At this point, Larry started to feel uncertain again. It looked like it was searching for something. Lin Li was surprised when he heard it. Searching? Yes, it had summoned 20 skeletal warriors, and they were all quite spread out. It was as if they were searching. Larry, with a doubtful look, continued, when we discovered it, it was too late to escape. Those 20 skeletal warriors surrounded us quickly, and then, we could only shout for help. So that's what happened. Lin Li nodded, and did not question further, he only felt very curious. What exactly was that hell ghoul looking for? The undead were not like magical beasts. They were unable to chase enemies through smell, they were only attracted to the scent of life. When he was hiding in the cave, he had already placed a ward of secrecy for life. A master-level ward of secrecy for life could even conceal the scent of life from a high-level vampire, what more a hell ghoul? How could a single hell ghoul do it? Maybe it was related to the crystal? Lin Li was terrified at this idea. Thinking back to that crystal, Lin Li remembered that there was black fog released from the hell ghoul when it was blasted. Within the black fog, there was a thick scent of death. When it seeped into the crystal, Lin Li could faintly feel that the scent emitted from the crystal was identical to a hell ghoul's. The deep red glow became even more profound and darker after the black fog seeped in. That piece of crystal was too mysterious. Lin Li felt that he should find some time and investigate it. Otherwise, it might bring forth trouble if he carried it out around cluelessly. If you guys do not have a place to rest tonight, after making up his mind, Lin Li saw that it was getting late, and hesitated again. Head to the cave first, we will talk tomorrow if there are any other matters. That's great. Larry had been worrying for the whole day. He was blocked by a hell ghoul at midnight, and surrounded by hundreds of skeletal warriors. He was thoroughly exhausted. Right now, was there any reason for him to reject Lin Li's invitation? Furthermore, this team's strength, as they had witnessed, was fiendish. It was especially so for that level 7 mage that spoke to him. He was a monster among monsters. Larry estimated that he was not inferior to that legendary top genius of Felon, Gryffindor. With such a powerful person protecting him, he could not ask for more. How could Larry be so foolish to reject it? This battle took up too much time. By the time they had returned the cave, the campfire had already died out, and the cave was pitch black. There were only 2 magewaths at the entrance of the cave, radiating a dim light in the dark. Thank you for watching Mystic Realms Recap. Please like, share and subscribe. Have a great day.